Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to this meeting of the Environmental Farming Act Science Advisory Panel. I would like to let everyone know that this meeting will be recorded. So if you do not consent to being recorded, please sign off the meeting and you'll be able to view the recording later. With that, we will begin the recording. So I'm calling this meeting of the Environmental Farming Act Science Advisory Panel to order. I'm Vicki Dolly, by the way. I'm the vice chair. Our chairman is stuck in traffic right now. He will be here to join us shortly, we hope. I'm now going to lead the roll call. Kaylee E. Bright, member with the California Department of Conservation.
Here.
Michelle Buffington, California Air Resources Board, Cal
Here.
EPA.
Here.
Member. Don Cameron, Terra Nova Ranch. Scott Couch with the State Water Resources Control Board and Cal EPA.
I'm here.
Leonard Diggs, Pie Ranch.
Here.
Jeff DeLotte will be joining us shortly. Amanda Hansen, not here. Eric Porce with the California Institute for Water Resources.
Here.
Judith Redmond, Full Belly Farm. And so we have a quorum. Item 1 is the approval of the November 9th, 2023 meeting minutes. Members need not have attended these meetings to vote on the minutes adoption, but may abstain. We will have an opportunity for panel discussion and then public comment. Am I supposed to read that? Okay, so first of all, so we have the meetings from the previous meeting. Are there any discussion, objection, addition, deletion?
Make a motion to approve.
I second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, motion passes. So now, if the members of the public would like to comment on the item, please raise your hand and we'll welcome your comment. No comments? Oh, yeah. Sorry, that was a little out of order. I'll get it straight next time. Let's see now. We're on the update. I would like to now introduce Tani Mata, the Director of the Office of Environmental Farming and Innovation and the CDFA Science Advisor for item 2, which is an update from the Office of Environmental Farming.
Good morning, everybody. It's good to see this panel so full this morning. It's exciting. Just a few updates from OFE. The first is that we had a busy grant-making fall. So since our last meeting, we announced our Dairy Plus, Alternative Manure Management, and Dairy Digester Research and Development Program awards in late 2023. As some of you may recall, the Dairy Plus program is new to us. It's a USDA-funded program through the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, and we have $75 million to spend. We have to do it within 3 years. So I appreciate the help of the panel and members of the public in making sure that we get enough interest in that program to spend on that money and make it go as far as possible for the state. We also announced our LEMUR, our Livestock Enteric Methane Research Program awards late last year. It was really exciting. Our RGA for us, we opened it up to proposals from across the country. And we rank them based on their benefits to the state of California, prioritizing California institutions for funding. But we think that they'll address a lot of the outstanding questions about the implementation of enteric methane reduction in the state. I wanted to address directly the governor's proposed budget. I sent out a note about this to our listserv, but I thought it's worth talking about here, and you may have some questions. The proposed budget on January 10th had a few changes to existing OFE programs and appropriations. You might have noticed that in late 2023, we launched the RGA for the SWEEP program and then promptly withdrew it or paused it. We did that in reaction to the developments in the state budget projections. Since the January 10th budget, that program is now proposed to be moved over to greenhouse gas reduction funding. That's really good news. We're happy to see a proposal to keep the program going. It does have some impacts on our ability to run the program as we proposed it to the panel last fall. So if you'll remember, we talked a bit about the development of our nitrous oxide tool. which was in its beta phase and would allow a wider swath of applicants to apply because they'd be eligible for greenhouse gas reductions beyond just converting pumps to electricity, for example. That methodology is not yet approved by CARB. And so if this funding does go over to greenhouse gas reduction funding, it's really important that CARB isn't on board with and approves the methodology that we're using for the nitrous oxide emissions. The OFI team is already reaching out and coordinating with CARB, and we can't make any promises, but we're optimistic that we'll be able to get in line with them and hopefully open the solicitation as expected, but once the new budget year starts in July of 2024. There were some programs that were undersubscribed, and some of the budget proposal was about cleaning up some of those funds. So, for example, the Water Efficiency Technical Assistance Program had some remaining funds from its solicitation, and those have been proposed to be eroded. People have been asking me why they're undersubscribed, and I think it's important to understand that in the last 3 years, we've had an enormous amount of funding, and it's not only challenging for the staff of OFI, which is about 30 people, to get that much money, hundreds of millions of dollars out the door. But it's also been challenging for our partners and our grantees to absorb that funding, especially for really specialized grant programs. So I want to emphasize that I don't think it's for lack of interest or need for water efficiency technical assistance, for example, but it's for lack of capacity or for our partner organizations and grantees to staff up fast enough to absorb that amount of funding in that short a time with that many opportunities. Carolyn Cook is here, and she'll talk a little bit later in the agenda about how this affects our Climate Smart Agriculture Technical Assistance Program. So we'd actually made those grants. Those are the partner grants for Healthy Soils, SWEEP, and AMP to help people apply for and manage those grants. We'd already made those grants before the budget changes or proposed changes were announced. So Carolyn's going to talk a little bit about how those proposed changes are affecting the CSATA program. And I just lastly want to say that, I almost forgot. Dairy methane is also proposed to move to GGRF funding in the new budget year. That funding is really important. It's part of our matching funding for that USDA Dairy Plus grant. We are probably going to still run the solicitation for that grant in the spring. There'll have to be a clause in the solicitation that says it's always possible that this funding could disappear. But to keep pace with the proposed timeline for Dairy Plus, we think we need to go ahead and move forward and get the applications out there and be optimistic. We wouldn't expect to encumber those grants until the fall anyway, or the new budget year. So it shouldn't hopefully disrupt the timeline of that grant program at all. And lastly, I want to say that this slowdown in funding means that it's very, very important that we elevate, highlight, advertise opportunities that our partners have for funding, especially NRCS, which has a historic amount of funding for climate smart agriculture. So we started to work with their communications team to make sure that we're using our listservs to advertise those opportunities. We're looking for ways to make our technical assistance funding more flexible to help people apply for those opportunities. And I welcome any input from the panel or from the public now or in emails to me about other funding opportunities that we could be highlighting through our communication channels to make sure that we don't lose momentum in achieving the state's climate goals. And with that, I'm happy to take questions from the panel or comments.
No, I just have you mentioned at the beginning you mentioned Dairy Plus several times, and then you mentioned another enteric methane product. And I'm afraid I'm not really familiar with those. Could you just say a few words to round out what those, you mentioned it was $75 million from USDA, and then another enteric, just a little more about those programs and how they relate to our work and so forth.
Yes, and I'm glad you asked that because I actually didn't mention the enteric incentives program, which was also affected by the proposed budget. Of the 8% of emissions in the state that come from agriculture and forestry, about 35% of them come from enteric methane. So it's a very major contributor to our part of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state. So initially in the last couple of years, the state has invested in research toward understanding how to mitigate enteric emissions. What are the opportunities for emerging technologies? How do we get these technologies through FDA approval? How do we ensure that the food supply is safe for some of these new technologies? Some of you may have heard of 3-NOP or Bovaer, which is a feed additive that is shown to reduce enteric methane and is currently in the FDA approval process. So we've been investing in research around enteric methane for the last couple of years. The Dairy Plus program is actually manure-based, so it's a program that's additive to AMP and DDRDP. It has a dual goal, not only of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but of reducing nutrient runoff and improving nutrient management on farm. So in order for a producer to be eligible for the Dairy Plus grant, they either need to be a past AMP or DDRDP recipient or a current AMP or DDRDP applicant. I think of it as our normal AMP and DDRDP programs on steroids. The Dairy Plus gives them a boost, provides extra funding, allows people to get even larger grants and do an even more comprehensive manure management practice on their property. One last thing about enteric that I did not mention was that we did have $25 million. We do have $25 million for an enteric methane incentive program through the state that has been proposed for a steep reduction down to everything but the administrative funding in the governor's budget. We think that we can use that administrative funding if we do indeed get to keep it, to keep doing the stakeholder outreach, the coordination, the program planning that we would need to eventually launch an enteric methane incentive program. And so that is our plan at this point. Does that answer your questions, Judith? Okay. Okay.
Hi, Kaylee with the Department of Conservation. One of the things that's really impacting our programs is the budget letter that came out in mid-December that restricted travel for our program staff, restricted contracting for all of our work. But it isn't totally clear for us how that's, we have some discretion to allow travel and contracting, but it isn't completely clear like where the boundaries are. But I'm just wondering at this point, like, for instance, for us, we are trying to figure out if we can justify doing site visits for land acquisition grants or doing meetings with partners, meetings with tribes. For the most part, we're being told no. So it's kind of how much do we want to push back and where do we want to push back? But I was wondering in your programs, if you thought the budget letter was going to have impacts just on program operations.
Yeah. In some ways, it would be less impactful than it would have been before COVID because we've moved to doing a lot of things virtually and for free, including a lot of our site verifications, which imagine if we'd had as much funding as we've had the last couple of years and had to do in-person verifications for all of them, would have been completely impossible, or we would have had to develop a new structure to do it, converted to block grants earlier. The discretion about whether OFI travels or when we travel is actually to me. We've cut back on our meeting attendance, not gone to conferences that we would normally go to, but we are thinking about where we strategically absolutely need to be there, or where we've already made commitments. For example, we already made commitments to be at the Tulare Ag Festival, have a big, long presentation, and we're going to go. It's a really important stakeholder meeting. There are lots of people there. So it is impacting us, but another example of that is that the SWEET program has technical reviewers for our direct-to-producer grants. And if we do get that funding, we're going to need to move early next year and have those technical reviewers in place. So we did indeed move those contracts. The money, we could cancel them at any time and it could go back into the pool. So we executed them. We're holding them. No work will be done until the new year. So that's kind of dealing with it on a case-by-case basis with how critical it is for staff to attend. And in some cases, if it's allowable and not against ethics rules, talking to whoever's inviting us to be somewhere about covering travel, creating a Form 700 nightmare for individual staff.
Okay, were there, member Couch.
I just have a comment on Kia Lee's comment. For us, I hear the words mission critical a lot. So the line that we have at the water board seems to be that the regional boards can go do inspections if they have their own vehicle and they're not going to file a TEC for expenses. So at least for us, that's kind of where the line is. If it's not going to incur an expense report and it's mission critical for something that you can do with your own resources, then that can be done. So
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of scenarios we could play out, but I think what's interesting is how it changes just the way that our programs interact with the public and the customers who are trying to utilize the programs. And, does that create any inequities or other issues with who can participate if you're changing the processes that we're following?
Absolutely. And we just had a meeting with some tribal representatives who were talking about how important it is for that in-person content, just kind of like getting to know you, not even like I went there for a purpose. Actually, I went there just to say hi and to get to know you. And so it does really create a barrier for some of those equity goals. Yeah, Michelle.
Michelle Buffington, California Air Resources Board. I was wondering if you had a table that kind of showed where how you had mentioned a bunch of programs that were shifting to GGRF. If there was a table that kind of talked about the dollar amount and the funding source, or if you could just go through those quickly.
You mean for this budget year?
Yes.
Yes, we did send out, actually, we launched an OFI newsletter for the first time in January. And part of that newsletter was talking specifically about the items in the budget that affected us. So I can share that, but I can also quickly run down for you. Sweep to GGRF, about 23 million. Dairy methane to GGRF, about 24 million remaining of an original $48 million appropriation. WEDA, almost look at Carolyn, I think it's like 6 million reversion back, I think. And the enteric methane reduction from 25 million down to just 2 million in administrative funding. I think those are the major impacted programs. Healthy soils, what we do have remaining that's currently in the solicitation that's running, it remains untouched.
One more comment or question? Done? Okay. All right then. So we've finished with that item, and I will now hand the meeting back over to Chair Delott.
Little traffic on 80 this morning. We're going to go ahead and move into item number 3, the regenerative ag definition update. And we are very pleased to have Josh with us today. And we're going to go ahead and have a presentation from Josh Eddy, the Executive Director of the State Board of Food and Agriculture. And Josh has been very busy. So we're very happy that you're here to provide us with an update.
Perfect. Thank you, Chair Delott and members of the panel. Look forward to kind of providing you an update of where the State Board, in partnership with the department and our stakeholders, are really developing kind of the definition for regenerative agriculture, really focusing on state policies and programs. The information provided here is the similar information that we provided to each of our current kind of public listening sessions that we've had. So it's kind of just a quick overview of where we're at and kind of a statement of kind of purpose. If we can move forward. So the motivation for defining regenerative agriculture really came from California's Ag Vision, which was put together in 2021, a kind of an update of a previous reiteration of previous Ag Vision work that has been occurring over the last last decade or so. And that process involved over 200 kind of informal stakeholders. Sorry. Involved over 200 stakeholders in the process to develop strategies to make California sustainable, successful, going forward into the future. And that vision outlined 5 kind of key priorities. And one of them was to foster climate smart, resilient, and regenerative food systems. And this was, again, kind of a public process that we went through, engaging with a variety of stakeholders, and then working through a committee, a task force, to actually further revise kind of the input we receive from stakeholders to kind of come up with that ag vision. So again, fostering a climate smart, resilient, and regenerative food system was one of the priorities that was identified. And what we're seeing from the legislative standpoint and also from a consumer standpoint is a lot of interest in the term regenerative agriculture. From a state perspective, I think from the department and even from members of the board, I think interest within the administration, within various departments and agencies to use the term regenerative in programs was a concern because there isn't a definition in Food and Agricultural Code or a definition in any of California's law defining what regenerative agriculture is. So if an agency was to create or establish a program outside of our department, for instance, focusing on regenerative agriculture, there wouldn't really be a baseline of what that is. And so really the board in our discussions felt that the state board going through a public process to kind of really define what regenerative agriculture means for state policies and programs, and recommending that to the Secretary for inclusion within Food and Agricultural Code would provide a baseline to establish that if a program, or if the administration comes out with a target in terms of climate, if a program is developed in the Energy Commission or through the Resources Agency or through the Department of Conservation, there is a definition in regenerative in Food and Agricultural Code that really defines the kind of the parameters of what regenerative agriculture is. So it's really kind of to help us kind of moving forward. And also our friends in the legislature, there's a lot of interest, again, consumer interest. And so again, providing that baseline that helps provide guidance from the industry through a public process of what that definition is something that the board felt was very important. And in addition, I think even our President Cameron, strongly suggested that the need for kind of a science-based criteria of what regenerative agriculture is. And so that really prompted this board to kind of move forward and engage with this panel to really kind of develop a framework, which you're very familiar with, of regenerative agriculture, that kind of really set the bumpers for us in terms of what that definition should be in terms of public. So we're kind of working with that framework, engaging with the public to kind of move forward in developing this process. So we understand that there's a lot of opinions surrounding regenerative agriculture, and the marketplace is continuously evolving. There's many certification programs that are currently existing for regenerative agriculture that are out there. And they don't all mean the same thing. Everyone has kind of their different version of it. But from the board standpoint, from the agency's standpoint, it's really looking at how we provide equity and inclusion in the process. We wanted to focus on public input and really engage. And that's why this public process, through listening through stakeholders, engaging with task force members, is really developing something that we could all have a shared vision in terms of what the definition of regenerative agriculture could be for state policies and programs. So to accomplish this, we've really kind of set kind of a key timeline of having 5 kind of public listening sessions. 2 of those public listening sessions have occurred, and I'll provide an overview of that shortly. And then also we wanted to establish a kind of a work group task force of members to really kind of take the public input that we've received, workshop kind of a potential definition, talk about the deeper issues that I will kind of highlight later on as well, and provide kind of a draft recommendation that will then go to the board for consideration and discussion. So the work group members are here, a lot of familiar faces. We thank both Chair Delott for being part of this process. It's very important to have kind of the input and guidance, definitely from the work that you all did and providing kind of that framework and that consensus. And we look very forward to kind of engaging with the diversity of these members that highlight not only actual practitioners, but also various representatives within the state and through various industries to really kind of provide us some further input of what's happening in terms of regenerative agriculture. The timeline, you as the panel completed your framework recommendation in 2023. That came to the board. And then we announced a series of public listening sessions, and we had a timeline for December until May of 2024 to kind of implement 5 public listening sessions. These sessions are being held virtually and also in person. They're being held in the evening to engage more stakeholders. So we're making sure that we're open and have a potential to engage. With these meetings are also being simultaneously translated, kind of moving forward as well to provide engagement of Spanish stakeholders. The work group meetings, we have 3 meetings scheduled. The first meeting has actually already occurred. That was in January 31st, and we have 2 additional meetings scheduled with the work group. Those dates are still being kind of defined based on some scheduling conflicts. The Natural Products Expo West was one of the key dates that we had identified, and a lot of our stakeholders are participating in that show, unfortunately. But one of the things that came out of our first work group session was really a dedication to spend more time, take more up to 4+ hours to really kind of sit down and engage in a discussion of some of those key issues that I know are kind of percolating at the top of when we talk about regenerative agriculture. What does that mean? And then the hope is that a recommendation from the work group will come to the board in June or July of this year. But we understand, and I think that this was expressed in the discussions that we had at the last work group meeting, is that it is a difficult subject, and if timelines need to be extended, that is something that we're definitely open to discussing and talking about in terms of how best to kind of achieve the goal that we're working on. This is really kind of a first in the nation process going forward. So we're really kind of setting the stage and really want to be considerate and want to get the best information that we can through the public stakeholder process to help inform kind of what that definition for state policies and programs will be. During the first of our public listening session, during our first public listening session, we had over 303 unique participants. So there was a lot of interest in the program. I don't think we've seen participation levels at this, except for the launch of Possibly Healthy Soils and also cannabis when we first began that process. But the key themes that have carried on through each of our work group discussions has really started is, do we start at really kind of a broader definition of regenerative agriculture, or do we start at a very narrow definition? And then also, what is the starting point? There's a lot of discussion and a lot of consideration that is organic the starting point for a regenerative? What does that mean if we start with organic? And so there's a lot of stakeholders that support both sides of that process. If you're a conventional grower, can you be regenerative? And so it's important that, again, this is a diverse industry within the state and that we're reflective of the diversity of the state, both large and small, conventional and organic, but this public process will help really determine what that starting point is as well. And I think one of the things that we heard loud and clear is also some of the challenges of transitioning to regenerative. From conventional agriculture to regenerative, there is thoughts that changes must be made, practices must be nurtured. And so how do we foster that within a definition and encourage individuals to be involved in the process? There was the thought that conventional growers need to be brought along. I think from California's standpoint, again, we are a very innovative industry, very diverse industry, and farmers have a deep commitment to being stewards of the land. And so I think it's a viewpoint that also needs to be considered within the process. And I know that a lot of our stakeholders and through the public comment sessions and even within the task force were aware of that. A big thing, and I know that Chair Delott highlighted this very much, and I know this is something that the panel highlighted as well, is that greenwashing must be avoided. When we say regenerative agriculture, what does regenerative agriculture mean? We actually have to have data that backs up what our claims are. Other comments really kind of focused on kind of more the social side as well. That's an element that we have not. I think that our next task force meeting will dive more concretely into is what is the social elements of regenerative agriculture. And so farm worker health was definitely provided as a process. Indigenous voices should also be included in the definition. As part of our work plan going forward, we have and are working with our tribal liaison here at the department to see how best to engage with our tribal nations in discussions on this topic. So hopefully to have a roundtable and focus group on that as well. A lot of thoughts, again, that conventional growers may be hesitant to adopt standards as a baseline for regenerative agriculture. And then the cost to transition, just as the cost to transition from conventional to organic, what is the cost factor of transitioning to a regenerative model? And then really education and demonstration project, technical assistance, themes that this panel is well aware of in terms of education of what regenerative means. Our second public listening session had 130 unique participants, and this was an in-person, kind of a hybrid meeting, both in person and online. And again, what was interesting, again, that highlight, there was, again, the opinions of where is organic the baseline? And that was really kind of a sticking point that we're at. I think that the last task force meeting that we have, first discussion point, that was really a consideration. Broad, narrow, organic is baseline, and it's still a discussion point as we're moving forward. Several commenters believe that regenerative agriculture, yes. A regenerative organic certified is definitely a term. There are several ROC certified entities within the state as one of the major certifiers, and that was highlighted as being maybe one of the baselines is a public process that is already existing in terms of within the marketplace as certifying as organic and in the process. One of the things that our board member, Doria Robinson, who is leading this process on behalf of the behalf of the State Board of Food and Agriculture, is really interested in bringing together practitioners of regenerative agriculture, those certifiers, those working with regenerative products, to really kind of see what are some of the key themes in their expression, because we don't want to do harm to the work that they're doing, but recognize the leadership that they have done in this space and what are those themes that carry in and are important to incorporate as part of a definition for state policies and programs. And again, I cannot stress enough, there is a strong emphasis across the board, both from conventional stakeholders and organic stakeholders, the importance of soil health and biodiversity. That was an ongoing theme that we heard over and over again. So it was very reflective of the work that you guys all provided as a panel in terms of a framework, in terms of soil health. So that was greatly appreciated. Certification accompanying the definition. That's a point that, again, the task force is also working on. So we're looking to see how best to kind of evolve through that. And then again, the narrow definition versus kind of more the broad continues to be the theme. And then in terms of the broad, it's more that big tent. If we have the bigger tent, more individuals can be involved in the process, more individuals can contribute and meet the goals that we're trying to do in terms of soil health and biodiversity, if the definition of regenerative agriculture for state policies and programs kind of incorporate that. And that kind of, is there a target that we can meet with this definition that helps to bring all the great work that we're doing through climate smart agricultural programs that are across the administration, benefiting the agricultural community and the lands that we are working on. And that kind of sums up kind of currently where we are at. Our next public listening sessions are scheduled for February 22nd, April 3rd, and May 29th. All of that information is available on our website, CDFA website, as well as all the presentations for each of the listening sessions, as well as a recording of those listening sessions so everyone can view it. Public comment is also being accepted through regenerativeag@cdfa.ca.gov. And we are hopeful to have the final schedule for the task force finalized within the next couple of weeks, looking at Virginia on that, to really provide us kind of that next step in terms of hearing from the stakeholders. And so what we're really doing is spacing out the task force engagements to kind of align with the public listening sessions. So this first session of the task force was able to see input for the first two sessions. The next series of public listening sessions will again inform the task force as they're moving forward as well. And I think the release of a kind of working draft of a definition through the task force, if approved, I think will further a lot of additional comment in the public space that will help to kind of inform their process as they move forward. And so with that, Chair Delat, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Josh. Yes, Tani.
I just want to note that member Hanson is online, so
great.
she's also present.
Perfect.
And I remind folks that you can put questions in the chat and we are monitoring it.
Great. Thank you for that. I'm going to open it up for questions, but I'm going to take just a small moment as the chair to say, and I said this at the meeting, that felt very proud to be a Californian and be part of a process that really started with public input going back to Ag Vision. And for those that we were also starting to work on the soil biodiversity report, and for those that look at that, that is also tied back to state policies and programs. They did a really good job of looking at Ag Vision and others. So in that biodiversity report refers back, and it sort of ties into what we'll be hearing later from the Deputy Secretary about the Ag and Climate Smart. And then there's been broad stakeholder input all along the way, both at our panel, then going to these listening sessions, to the work group, and coming back. And it was in that spirit that I did invite Josh to come and present to us to make sure, because you may have you've seen the comments, you did a great job. And I think that's reflective of where it's at. It is a very active discussion, big tent, little tent, what technology, what not technology. Those are big questions, and I'm sure we'll struggle with them. But more importantly, I think we're asking those questions in a public and open forum with all of your input. And I will say I emphasize all of the panel members when I present and make sure that I see it as a real advantage of having the cross agencies. It's a really important and brings a level of credibility to that. So if you don't agree with our framework we developed, I'd encourage you to get active now, because folks were part of the Ag Vision, and then we're part of the other components, the work that the state board, and I should definitely, I'm sorry, Donna, the state board has been incredibly open and has put that, and did not have to make a choice to make this public, right? And did make a choice, which meant more work, more time, under budget constraints. So I really want to thank Don and his leadership. So I think this is just an example of how public policy is supposed to work in a democratic society with open access to input. So just want to take that for a moment to say, and thank you all, because we also have everybody here. With Amanda on the phone, we have our full complement, and I think that's reflective of your all commitment. So first of all, so thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And that process. Now, are there any questions or comments for Josh? We'll open it up to public comment, but anything as you've seen? Yes, Member Couch.
I just was curious. That's a good turnout you've had for the first two meetings, and I'm curious what mechanism you're using to get the word out. Is it just people who signed up for your email list, or are you doing something else to?
So we've done a lot of kind of social media promotion of the first announcement, and so that generated a lot of the 303 participants. We will follow up to encourage that for the future listening sessions through a variety of blog posts through social media, kind of really announcing that. The primary vehicle has just been like this committee, this panel is promoted, and the board is promoted through news release saying, here's the opportunities for public comment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Member Edmond, then Member Dix.
Just a reminder, get really close to your mics. Some folks are having a hard time hearing.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was really a helpful and great presentation. I'd love to maybe have access to it. Is it on the CDFA website?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I just took a portion of these slides that were actually on our website, on the regenerative website from our last public listening session.
Yeah,
So
because there's definitely a lot of interest in my world in the work that you're doing, and people asking a lot of questions about it. And I just want to say one thing, which the salient point for me, and I would want to rise it up within the discussion, is the transition question. And it seems like the reason for a lot of these programs is because we do want to see that transition take place over time in California agriculture. And so thinking about all of the different points of how to make the definition work in practice and be the most effective, what we really want to see, I think, is programs that will encourage that transition. And so, I mean, my experience has led me to think that a broad tent and a broader definition helps in bringing people in. And although I do think that greenwashing is a very serious concern. So balancing those things is really the challenge. Yeah.
Yes. And Member Redmond, it was definitely a theme that we heard loud and clear through the task force process. I think that the challenge of how do we move a process forward, how do we transition, was definitely kind of a key theme, and I'm sure that that will be discussed in detail at our next session as well. Thank you.
Good to see you, Josh.
Good to see you, sir.
What role is the board and CDFA in general feeling like the state should take in this understanding and activation of regenerative ag? So specifically, for example, the data that you were referring to, it seems like there's going to be a lot of work to come up with data that's really important. Does the state see a role for itself there? Or if there was a certification that came up, similar to the state registration for organic, does the state see a role for itself? What are some of those discussion points that are going on?
Perfect. And panel member Diggs, thank you so much for that. I think, again, certification is not the intent of the board. Our focus has really been to kind of define regenerative agriculture for state policies and programs. Certification has come up several times, but again, I think the concern that the board has seen is interest among consumers, interest among the legislature, interest among state agencies to kind of really focus on regenerative programs is kind of where that where there was a need then from the board standpoint to work to define regenerative agriculture for state policies and programs, to provide kind of that guidepost. And so the board's current proposal under our discussions has been to, once we have a recommendation from the task force, that board will then to kind of debate and decide on that definition, and then submit that definition with a recommendation to the secretary for action. And I would assume from a staff perspective that that action would be to work to include that definition within food and agricultural code. So for the data points, et cetera, in terms of the development of that, I think it's still too early in the process to see where that definition is headed in terms of how do we, like I mentioned, avoid the greenwashing, but where is the definition that comes from the stakeholder through the public process? What information is being requested, and how best then, once that is determined, does that inform the recommendation to the secretary? If that makes sense. Thank you.
Are there other panel member questions or comments? Josh, I'll just add one point. I think some folks are struggling with this concept of state policy and programs, meaning that that's a very different target and focus. And so in the discussions, I think we spend a lot of time trying to get folks on the same page of what that means, so that this would be a grant program potentially, and the definition would inform a request for assistance, and it would develop the points for the criteria for score, just like healthy soil, just like sweep, just like everything else. And I think that's been a really hard component, and I think we'll be struggling with that as we go through. So I'm only raising it now because if we all do talk to people, and it's good to get that out, that really that's in part, and goes to your question, Member Diggs, is like, how do we see this being implemented? And I think some of it is like, well, it's going to be in the market first. And that's not the charge of this definition. It's the policy and programs first. And I think there's a little tension there, but it's only because, not everyone pays a lot of attention to policy and programs as much as say we all do. So, yes.
So, yeah, so one real world example of how this could be utilized by us. We run the Sustainable Agricultural Land Conservation Program. We provide grants to protect ag lands. We provide all these bonus points for different attributes on the land. We would then likely pick up the definition and give it as an advantage maybe to the process to help people protect those lands and continue doing the regenerative work that they're doing. So
thank you.
Share that.
Yeah, that's a very great example. Perfect. Thank you. Yes, Member Cameron.
Chair Dillette, I'd like to thank you and Josh Eddy both for the amount of time that you've put in and will put in on this, because it is a very complex issue and very little controversial within the state. But, and this is for programs. We know that there's many definitions of regenerative ag. I spent 45 minutes talking to the head of the Soil Health Institute out of North Carolina, and their implementation of regenerative agriculture throughout the United States, and primarily with conventional growers, and they've got a lot of acceptance that they're seeing through in many areas of the U.S. and it's all based on soil health, which comes back to what we're centered about, really. I mean, but and you've got buyers that are putting their definition from the top down to growers, and you've got some larger growers that are coming up with their own definition and labeling. So, you've got a lot of different forces out here, but I think this is really the primary focus is for the programs and the grants and guidance for the agencies here in Sacramento. So thank you both.
Thank you. Yes, Member Porst.
Thanks very much. And Josh, thanks for the overview. I only joined late last year, so I wasn't part of a lot of the prior work of the board as part of this. So it's very informative. And just had a question for you in the last two listening sessions. When we talk about this internally within the University of California or with others, a lot of times one of the first questions that comes up is, what's the difference between regenerative agriculture and climate smart agriculture? And I didn't notice that specifically noted on the slides. So I was just wondering if that had come up in the recent working groups, and especially since there may be some basis in this informs grant programs. If you could address that, or if that's something still to get more input on.
No, that's a very good point. I think it's interesting. I think from the last couple listening sessions, my impression was that there was definitely a climate smart ag was being put into kind of that regenerative bucket, so to speak. But there hasn't really been kind of a discussion of, oh, what does climate smart ag mean versus regenerative in kind of the discussion that we've had so far. But I think the focus on soil health, where we have a lot of our climate smart agricultural programs dedicated, I think definitely shows an indication that it will be what I would consider from a staff perspective within kind of that climate space. But again, I would defer to the process and what comes out of it.
All righty, we'll go ahead and open it up for public comment. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Josh. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks.
Yeah, we have a few comments and questions in the chat. The first is just a comment from an anonymous attendee. They say that there was a lot of grassroots outreach around these listening sessions as well. The second one is from a question from Justin Miller. He says, "Good day. I'm trying to understand how regenerative agriculture is different from organic farming."
That can come up at the next session of the
Well, I
listening
think,
session.
again, participation in the public listening sessions, I would encourage, because there's a lot of chat that goes on in the chat boxes on the discussion, but I think a lot of comments as well that provide the overview of where organic is and where regenerative is and where those lines are and how they intersect or don't intersect. So I would encourage participation in the listening sessions to learn more.
Great.
There's one more question, unless you want to comment on that. Sorry.
Oh, comment on that.
Did I interrupt you from commenting?
No. I think at this point, the process, I think Josh answered it. The process is an ongoing, and that's really the most appropriate forum for that.
Okay. The last one says, "Hello, thank you for a great presentation. This may not fit in perfectly with the discussion today, but I'm curious what kind of support can controlled environment agricultural growers can get to solve some of the waste composting issues? Any help incentives for decentralized solution, waste to energy, or circular economy will be extremely helpful in reducing associated emissions. Thank you."
Yes, Member Redmond. Yeah.
I think Member Cameron kind of brought up the fact that regenerative agriculture has a pretty, it really started, that term really started in the Midwest, and it's being used by many farmers to refer to their practices. And I think in California it may have a little bit of a different genesis and a little bit of a different following, but we should all understand that it's being used and has been used for many years in Midwestern agriculture, and it includes the extensive use of herbicides, which is just to say that maybe in our work we think about ways that agriculture can reduce the use of some of those chemicals as part of the move towards regenerative agriculture.
And if I could add, panel member Edmund, is that I think our board member Doria Robinson, who's leading the process, is very interested again in engaging with practitioners and certifiers to kind of really learn from best practices kind of in the process to help inform as we move forward as well. So I appreciate that.
And to your point, Member Redmond, I think California obviously is a different context than Midwest ag in so many different ways. And we all know that, living, working, being involved in California ag. But I think it is important because the sheer number of soil types and growing conditions and microclimates and all of those things, and it's in part why if you study soil health at a national level, it sometimes some of the details of a particular region may not be as bright. The light might shine as bright. It's one of the reasons why this group put together the below ground biodiversity to focus on what does below ground biodiversity and nature-based solutions look like for California agriculture, right? So it's in no way a criticism to the Soil Health Institute at the national level, but because of our uniqueness, I think we've taken those steps to put the data in place. And if folks say, well, where do we start on looking at soil metrics. Well, we have a world-class report that is got put forward in part through this to say, hey, this is a great place to start. Let's go look at this. So I think that might come up. We'll see that. That is a very biased in science advisory panel perspective that you're getting because we were involved in that biodiversity report and the framework. So I know that that's not necessarily a public, but I think just wanted you all to be proud about the work that you've done to feed into this process from a very California-centric perspective. Yes, member Cameron.
We did have a discussion about the soil biodiversity, and I guarantee you we are head and shoulders above the rest of the United States on looking at the soil biodiversity that we have here. So it was an enlightening conversation. It was good.
I think we're well positioned to, and of course it's an honor for me on the work group, but it's also responsibility. So if you listen or hear, please provide feedback directly. I'm going to do my best to represent and also put on my professional hat in my other work, but I do take it as a deep responsibility to not go out of bounds of where we all got to. So, yeah. Okay. Oh, there's more comments?
There's more, yeah.
Okay.
And questions. This one's from Rami Kolfer. They say organic farmers are concerned that customers at the grocery store will be confused by a regenerative agriculture definition that includes conventional farming inputs. Is the discussion to have two distinct definitions, one being conventional regenerative agriculture and one being organic regenerative agriculture?
I think, and I'll speak, there is I won't say it's a proposal, there was discussion about this concept of a tiered approach, that there could be multiple endpoints. One endpoint could be regenerative organic certification. That could be, because that defines the edge, but there may be other edges and it may not be linear, right? So it could be there's a bunch of different three-dimensional or more. So I think that idea, I'm not saying that idea has been kicked around, but I think it gets to this sense is there a definition with a binary 0 or 1, or is there something that's more inclusive, many more variables, say, than 2? And you can see where I'm going. I'm a little more on the inclusivity, sort of broad-based. What does that really mean for society to have inclusive policies? And it may be not 0 and 1, maybe a little broader than that, but this will get wrestled with.
I would just add to Chair Delat's remarks that, again, the focus is on state policies and programs. And so really this is, again, just like panel member Bright highlighted, the opportunities within state government for programs and policies and how that opportunity and how the definition would apply in that context and not within the marketplace.
And one more. This is from David Horwitz. To what extent is the soil health going to be founded on perennial agroecology with its benefits to carbon sequestration and living tissue and in constant carbohydrate pulses to the soil? And to what extent is integrated livestock management involved? And to what extent is tree planting being emphasized, such as leguminous trees, to capture carbon and accumulate excess nutrient leachings in the soil in the case of imbalances in the learning curve being applied?
I would just say for all of these, I really encourage you for those on the Zoom to submit those to the state, and the email for submission. We have an email. Regenerative Ag. Yes. So don't waste that comment because we don't have the action item here. It's not our purview anymore. So submit that comment. Make sure it gets into the public record. And I've been telling folks that in all these, it's like, even though that the process has been very good and it's all transparent, you can actually go onto the site that Josh mentioned and you can see the transcript from all of the meetings, including the chat. Some of them are hundreds of pages long. So it's a very open and inclusive process. And I think just encouraged to make sure people's voice get in there. So these kinds of comments to go ahead and get in there. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead. Thanks everybody for very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the panel for all of your work in this process. It's greatly appreciated by the board and the department. And thank you again for being part of this public process. Appreciate it.
Great. Okay, we are now going to move to the climate smart agricultural technical assistance funding update, and we're going to hear from our senior environmental scientist, Carolyn Cook, who's going to provide an update on that. And we will have an opportunity for both online and in-person public comment. So with that, Carolyn.
Yeah, good morning, panel members and members of the public. Let me make sure my audio is okay. Is it okay?
It's the mic seem a little
I like this. It's okay. Okay. Okay, good. Okay. Well, great. Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to be here this morning. I'm going to talk about the Climate Smart Agriculture Technical Assistance Program. There are two things I'm really updating you on, and so I want to mention them here so you can pick them up throughout the presentation slides. So one thing is, how is CDFA, our office, aligning the Climate Smart Agriculture Technical Assistance Program with the focus areas of the Technical Assistance Memorandum of Agreement that CDFA has signed on with partners. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that Memorandum of Agreement, but that's one thing I want to talk about. And then the other is, how have program changes that we've implemented to align with that MOA really taken effect, and how have they helped us adapt to the situation that Dr. Mata talked about with the budget? So I'll go on. And the first slide is just background. So we've talked about this program, the Climate Smart Ag Technical Assistance Program, for a number of years here at these panel meetings. Assembly Bill 2377 in 2018 established this program, and it was to provide technical assistance to individual farmers and ranchers who are interested in applying or have received incentive awards from CDFA's sort of three core direct-to-producer programs. And those are the Healthy Soils Program, the SWEET program focused on irrigation, and also the AMP program, the Alternative Manure Management Program. So the program really took shape in 2020, and from 2020 to 2022, we awarded 75 projects, $5.2 million to support the three programs. We're missing the first year, which was 2018. 2019, we had more projects in that. The original program was really focused on two somewhat narrow objectives: providing pre-application assistance, or that application assistance to producers that want to participate in the programs. That includes outreach, but also helping farmers to apply in all kinds of at different levels. Sometimes people just have questions. Sometimes people really want somebody to help them submit the application. And then the second objective of the program was to then provide that implementation assistance throughout the grant term for those producers. And so that does involve liaison services, which I've mentioned before, we really appreciate at CDFA, helping folks to navigate our grant procedures, but also working with them on the ground to make sure that they get their project installed successfully. Okay, so now going on a little bit to talk here about the Memorandum of Agreement that CDFA has signed on to with partners. In late 2022, CDFA, USDA, NRCS, University of California A&R, and California Resource Conservation District Association signed a Memorandum of Agreement focused on technical assistance. All of our organizations provide technical assistance in different ways. We're all going to continue doing that, whether or not there was this Memorandum of Agreement or not. The idea behind the Memorandum of Agreement was to try to synergize and align our efforts to be more effective, reach a greater audience. And there are several key messages. The four primary partners are collaborating to increase the effectiveness of their individual yet complementary services. Aligning those efforts will result in better utilization of what each partner brings to the table. So for example, CDFA for a number of years has had significant funding to offer, but maybe not boots on the ground to work with producers. And then customers will experience streamlined assistance instead of navigating the process of multiple organizations on their own. And I think that's an important one that we've talked about quite a bit in meetings with our partners, is basically kind of the handoff, making it as seamless as possible. So instead of somebody calling CDFA and us saying, unfortunately, we don't do that, but maybe they do over at NRCS, it would be best if all of our staff was confident that they knew what does NRCS have to offer and who's the right person to talk to. And we can just be a little bit more seamless with that handoff. Okay. Thank you. I don't know if this will, I don't know if this will help. So there's a few areas of emphasis mentioned in the memorandum of agreement, and I wanted to mention them here and talk about them in a little bit of detail because they did inform, the updates that we recently made to the technical assistance program. So the first one is equity in the delivery of technical assistance, basically focusing on equity and making sure that our programs are accessible and reaching underserved producers, historically underserved producers as well. That's aligned with CDFA's, not CDFA's, the state's Farm Equity Act. And then conservation, innovation, and practices. So basically facilitating that pipeline. And it's interesting hearing about the conversation with regenerative agriculture, but basically taking new research, that innovation pipeline, and getting it to, the ground, maybe through programs or policies. Coordination, that's kind of what I just talked about, that handoff. And then technical capacity through training. What we know is that although there's a lot of organizations around the state providing technical assistance, it's not always equal. Some geographies are being left out of certain types of technical assistance because there's not the expertise there. Consistently locally led TA, the focus there being on locally led, meaning, let's build a relationship. There's somebody there to build a relationship with, an ongoing relationship. And then collective impact and communication. We've talked about that here at the panel meetings quite a bit, storytelling more about what our programs are resulting in, the successes, and it's probably the challenges too. So in the framing of that, I want to talk about some of the changes that we've made to the Climate Smart Ag Technical Assistance Program. And then at the end of each of these slides, I want to point out right now so I don't forget, but I highlighted basically what area of focus I think is being addressed with the change to the program. So we increased in the most recent funding cycle for the TA program, we increased the program cap for translation and interpretation. So organizations that were able to provide that service, that bilingual service to producers, could actually request a higher award. This table's a little bit complicated, but quite a few of the organizations that applied to the CDFA Technical Assistance Program in the last funding cycle did take advantage of this, basically offering services in Spanish, Hmong, Punjabi. Those were all languages that folks wanted to support. And I've highlighted that I think this supports that a lot, that area of focus in the MOA of equity in the delivery of technical assistance. Okay, we also work to expand the program's objectives to essentially be more flexible. What we saw in the earliest funding cycle of the Climate Smart Agriculture Technical Assistance Program is that we made awards for quite a bit of money, like I think it was $2 million in that first cycle, but in the end, folks only used about half that money. That was probably because the scope of the program is too narrow and it didn't allow enough opportunities for folks to fully take advantage of that funding. And also it's very difficult to predict how many people am I actually going to be able to help and use my services for a certain amount of money. So objective 3, which we added into the program, is to support the verification of healthy soils and sweep projects. The last couple of years of funding for healthy soils and sweep have been pretty overwhelming. Then there was COVID, and we changed our protocols to remote verifications, basically for all of the projects, which means we're seeing very few projects on the ground now. So one of the things I'm looking forward to with having technical assistance providers go out and visit projects is actually getting to see them again, and getting actual real pictures of the projects on the ground, building that relationship again. And the way I see this verification supporting the MOA as well is that it's kind of like a last chance to make a connection. Projects are getting verified when they're complete. Maybe that producer hasn't used a technical assistance provider to help them apply. Maybe they haven't used a technical assistance provider to help them manage their project implementation, but this is a last chance to get an introduction, perhaps build a relationship with a local technical assistance provider that can then help them in the future. Let's see. I want to make sure I got my. Oh, okay. So one other thing I wanted to mention here, because Dr. Mata talked about the budget scenario and how we'd opened the sweep solicitation and then closed it up. And that was unfortunate. That was a little stressful for technical assistance providers who had been gearing up to help people apply to the program, probably even helped a couple of people get started. And then we had to put a pause on that. So we've really leaned into this option of helping people with project verifications now, because we do have a previous funding cycle that is going to be coming to the end of its term in June of 2024. So we have 100 projects or more in sweep that need to be verified in the next couple months. So we're really looking for technical assistance providers to help us with this. And even organizations that did not initially say, hey, I want to do verifications, we've invited them in to help us with this objective, because it's really important. Gives them also a way to use this funding right now. Okay. Right. So another way we've expanded the grant funded activities is this objective for additional activities. And so technical assistance providers could apply for up to 20% of their budget to do these 4 different things. The first bulleted item here is provide training to producers. That's sort of really general one-on-one training. Come out to your farm, help them learn how to use maybe the new technology that they funded through SWEEP, or maybe they're not even quite ready to apply to the SWEEP or Healthy Soils program, but they can get some initial training or brainstorm about that. The third bullet, I'll go there, is to consult with unawarded applicants. So our programs have been so oversubscribed for a few years, the Healthy Soils program and the SWEEP program, that a lot of folks apply and they don't get funded. We don't necessarily want those folks to lose touch then with the technical assistance provider that helped them. So the first and third bullet I wanted to point out, that's sort of like maintaining relationships, and I really think that's important. The second bullet, preparing case studies, this is something that we've also supported in past funding cycles of the technical assistance program. But with the budget situation, we're also leaning into this one now, basically following up with folks who've received funding from the past. Our team would love if we could get a little bit more quantitative outcome reporting, basically through these case studies, and possibly even look at some of the economic outcomes. Those would be wonderful, but we're also happy to accept sort of storytelling case studies too, that are just those stories about, I did this and now I'm seeing these types of benefits. So that should help us address that collective impact part of the technical assistance memorandum of agreement. And then the last one I'm going to focus my next couple slides on is obtaining training. By that, building capacity, continuing education for staff members that are at those technical assistance organizations, but also could be bringing on new staff members and getting them some onboarding training. Okay. Yes, so the challenge that I talked about already is that the demand for technical assistance does exceed the supply that's available. We often have folks calling, do I have a technical assistance provider in my area? And sometimes the answer is no, we don't have a contracted one in your area. So that can be disappointing. And like I mentioned before, sometimes the expertise is not geographically distributed. I will point out, for example, we've had this technical assistance program to support the AMP program for a number of years. We have only about 3 organizations that come back every year for funding for supporting AMP practices. So there's a real, perhaps either, maybe it's not a lack of expertise, but we could build that out some more. Support for manure management practices. Let's see. Yeah, and then another thing that's come up internally at CDFA as we've been talking about the technical assistance memorandum of agreement, also how we can make the technical assistance program that we have more flexible is just the fact that a lot of CDFA's work outside of OFI is going to involve or does already involve technical assistance, and we're maybe not coordinating that very well. So for example, we have a produce safety program that has technical assistance integrated into it. There's a bit of a nexus sometimes between food safety and some of the practices that we fund in the Healthy Soils program. And so there's an opportunity there for us to encourage the technical assistance providers that we work with to just get some training, get a little bit of continuing ed on those other topics so that they can maybe not be the expert that that producer needs, but they can help with the handoff, or they can speak the same sort of vocabulary and language in talking about those other issues that maybe are not directly dealt with in OFI. So we are encouraging technical assistance providers to seek out this type of training now, and we will fund it up to 20% of their climate smart agriculture technical assistance budget. So to close out, I only have 1 or 2 more slides. In November, we finally executed the newest round of technical assistance awards. We have 20 new awards totaling $2.7 million to support all 3 programs, AMP, Healthy Soils, and SWEEP. The project term will go through the end of October 2026. And Healthy Soils technical assistance providers, of course, have been very busy. Healthy Soils program is accepting applications right now. So a lot of those technical assistance providers are focused there on doing that. The SWEEP technical assistance providers, when we paused the solicitation, we actually had a meeting with them to talk about how to pivot, seeking out their interest in helping us with verification, surveying their interest, and then preparing assignments for anybody who wanted to be a project verifier for SWEEP. Okay, so this last slide, I want to address just moving forward what we're going to do. We're going to continue to look for ways to offer flexibility to climate smart agriculture technical assistance awardees. Ideally, when we make awards to technical assistance organizations, they would be able to utilize all those funds during the grant term. So we will focus on doing that. We'll look for other ways to align with the technical assistance MOA and find gaps that we can fill, maybe gaps at our partner organizations, like if they have identified a way that we could help. And I want to acknowledge that it's difficult for the technical assistance applicant organizations to estimate the demand for their application and project implementation assistance, especially when you consider how much some of the programs are oversubscribed. We might have an organization help 30 people apply to the program, and if they only end up getting a handful of awards just because we've been so oversubscribed, we want to continue to have ways for them to use the money. Let's see. And then I wanted to acknowledge that the funding for the technical assistance program, of course, is reliant on the funding that comes to the other programs. So it's just a reality that we may have to adjust the program framework, for example, those maximum funding caps as time goes on, depending on how much funding comes to the programs. Yep, and then as far as the technical assistance MOA goes, we're excited to lead a work group focused on equity in the delivery of technical assistance, which is one of the areas of focus that I mentioned. And so we'll be tackling that work group soon, looking to identify our shared priorities, I think is going to be the first step there. And that's the end of my slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. Are there questions or comments from panel members? Great. Seeing none, are there any questions online? Yeah.
Yes, excuse me. There's a question from Ian Vietti. Could you explain the rationale behind the prohibition of for-profit individuals giving technical assistance, even under the hire of a nonprofit? There is additional capacity out there as seen by the success of the CAP-GAP program.
Okay, I think there were two things. Is it okay for me to answer that question? I noticed two things in that question. So AB 2377, which was the legislation that established the TA program that we have, it actually defined technical assistance providers, and it listed the types of organizations that could participate in that way. So they were limited to nonprofits, University of California Cooperative Extension, and resource conservation districts. That actually got amended, I think, last year. And so it's opened it up a little bit more to irrigation districts. And I think another maybe groundwater sustainability agencies, but I would have to look at that. So it also seemed like Mr. Vietti was asking about participating as an individual through a nonprofit, and I don't actually see how that would be restricted.
Yeah, same. Maybe I will just add that the state needs to be careful about funding proprietary technology or paying for people that advertise and push specific proprietary technologies. So that's always been a concern with private vendors, whether or not they're truly giving the producers all of the options or if they're pushing a specific technology.
All righty. Thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you.
I think we're going to go ahead and move on to item number 5, which is our climate resiliency strategy for California agriculture. And I'd like to welcome CDFA Deputy Secretary for Working Lands and Climate, Virginia Jameson, who will be presenting. And this is a decisional, potentially a decisional item. And you'll be clear to us when we get to the decisional component.
Yeah, so the purpose of the presentation to you today is to really solicit your feedback for what you think there needs to be further discussion at the panel level on to contribute to the climate resiliency strategy. I am going to go through some of the background of this again, so just bear with me, but we've got a lot of new folks online who maybe haven't heard what we're doing, and we want to provide the background for them too. So you can go on to the next slide, please. So I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear that agriculture is facing enormous climate change challenges. We've already talked about this morning that agriculture is responsible for some emissions globally. In California, it's about 9%. Carolyn recently pointed out to me that as other sectors share of emissions shrink, agriculture's grows. So you'll see that number fluctuate a little bit over time. However, California is also leading in terms of solutions, expertise, and research. And our intention here for doing a strategy is to capture California agriculture's myriad approaches to climate adaptation, resilience, and mitigation, of which we have many. An intention is to communicate with agricultural stakeholders and the public about climate risks, mitigation strategies, and CDFA's activities, as well as activities at other state agencies. And I'm smiling at Michelle because the Air Resources Board, of course, has many programs that affect agriculture, and we'd want to share those as well as the ones happening elsewhere. So you can go to the next slide. And so given that these different agencies in the state have climate solutions for agriculture, it seems important for us to get them all into one place. Currently, there's no overarching strategy for us to address or respond to climate change. No, these single issue strategies and responses are spread across multiple agencies. So Michelle can speak to what her programs are later on, but they're all across different departments. There's hotter, drier future document at Department of Water Resources. There's the scoping plan at the Air Resources Board. There are specific programs with specific goals. There's an energy, renewable energy target in the scoping plan that is handled by CEC and the CPUC. So one of our goals is to create a single place for all of our agency partners, the public, the legislature, and stakeholders to refer to for an overview of the state's actions on climate change resiliency for agriculture, or to give them a way to identify investments that would address critical gaps in research or action. We've already talked a little bit this morning about the ag vision for the next decade and how the #1 priority listed in that document was to foster climate smart, resilient, and regenerative food systems. And in order to address that priority, along with defining regenerative agriculture and what that means, we need to make a concerted effort to strategize about how to get there and to give the public an opportunity to provide input. And we believe that implementation of a climate resiliency plan for agriculture will help us achieve the strategic vision set out in Ag Vision and help fulfill the purpose statement that we use across CDFA to define our work, that we make California a better place to live because of what we grow and how we grow it. So on to the next slide. So at our last Science Advisory Panel meeting, we talked about what the structure might look like, providing an overview of all climate and ag issues, the changing conditions, the uniqueness of California agriculture. We're in a Mediterranean climate. There are not very many of those in the world. We have excellent prime soils for farming, which globally those are being diminished. And then providing sections by topic area. So we'd dig in deeper into each of those sections so that people could get a sense of them. So moving on to the next slide. I won't read every single one of these, but these are places that we've identified that seem to warrant their own section. You might have other ideas and the public might have other ideas, and we would really like to hear what those ideas are. And there may be room for things like call out boxes on specific strategies or references to other documents so that people can learn more about each of these things. But to just really capture what we're doing, what we're not doing yet, where we need to focus research and additional effort. So you can go on to the next slide. So we've talked about how in each of those sections, we would talk about, again, the description of the challenge, the climate connection to that topic, the current challenges associated with it. We, again, want equity to be part of and integral to everything we do at CDFA, and that doesn't exclude this plan. So we would want to talk about how equitable distribution of resources and participation is affected within each of these sections. We would want to talk about efforts that are underway, and this again is going to include consultation with other state agencies to learn about the work that they've already done on a lot of these things. So again, looking at you, Michelle, you, Kaylee, Amanda online, to bring in and incorporate what you've already done, because it's not our intention to recreate the wheels you've already spent so much time on, but we do want to make sure that our stakeholders are aware of those efforts. We want to include discussions of technical assistance and how we can help people utilize the resources that exist, in any gaps in accessing those resources. And we want to identify areas for additional research. And remember, of course, this is a place where it would be really great to coordinate with UC. So we know you're in the midst of your 10-year strategy. Is it 10-year? Anyway, you're in a strategic planning process too about research. And so we want to make sure that we're in coordination with you and identifying research gaps and opportunities. So next slide, please. So in the past, the Science Advisory Panel, of course, has reviewed many topics, and most of you have been around longer than I have, and will have a better recollection of the things that you've discussed. So we see a role for you in providing guidance on identifying research gaps, reviewing the draft document, and then coming to a key purpose of today, providing a discussion of relevant topics at meetings to inform the document. And so what I'm hoping we can do today is delve in a little bit to what you think hasn't been discussed perhaps, or warrants more discussion. And next slide, please. So I wanted to provide a little bit of an update on where we are today. I think last time I presented to you, I was extremely optimistic about where I would be at this point, but there have been a couple things that have come up. Kaylee mentioned the budget letter and expenditure freezes, and that has really slowed down our efforts to find a facilitator that can help carry out this work. But we're taking that in stride and figuring out what we can do in the meantime. And a couple of those things have been the hiring of an AB 32 climate scientist. That's Nina Bingham. Nina can wave from back there. So she's going to be my partner in crime on this strategy, and also our executive fellow, Margaret Phipps. Margaret can wave too. So we have been able to staff up a bit, and that's going to really facilitate this progress on this document. So yeah, that brings me to the question for the day. If you can go into the next slide. I would really like to hear from you what conversations would be most useful for the panel to convene related to the strategy over the course of this year. What aspects of climate and agriculture have not had a robust public discussion, and what areas of science are rapidly advancing and warrant an overview. And of course, that question is open to the public who's listening in today too. But that concludes my slideshow, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you think.
All righty. Well, you're open those questions right there to your colleagues on this panel, correct? Yes, to start. Yes, Member Diggs.
First, thank you for all this ongoing work. I wrote a few comments on a couple of different areas. The place, in regards to the one place where all this information can land, I think it really needs to be easy to find. It's number one, and interactive in ways that address what I'm hearing from younger people in terms of their fears. There's a generational shift where now younger people are really afraid about their future. And a lot of it is in regards to the climate chaos that we currently have. And so I think that there has to be a place for listening to this younger generation, their feelings and their hopelessness, and hopefully providing them some solutions. In regards to the resilient food system, I think the empowerment also of the public, and to show them what their part to play in this is, both in the products that they produce at home, what they purchase in the marketplace, and without being political, how they vote at the ballot box does matter. But specifically what they can do at home would be those things like from food waste to solar energy. And showing them that there is a part for them to play as part of this involvement. It's not just someone else out there, because I think that engagement is going to be essential in terms to having the public be supportive of the state's efforts. I also think the terminology that you used about diminishing the arable land globally harkens me back to what people who have livestock and pastures and say to folks like myself who have row crops and being arable farmers as an insult, really, in the sense of that we are opening up the ground. And so I think that to protect California agriculture, obviously, we're talking about regenerative farming, that this less arable farming practices or the integration of arable and less arable practices, because there are times when opening up the soil may make sense, but we need to explain that, and then also what are the moves and which crops allow us to have arability. I have comments to make on the topics, but I'm going to stop there and come back to those.
Thank you. I really appreciate those perspectives.
Thank you, Member Diggs. Yes, Member Dolly.
Yeah, I also made a few notes. As far as things that maybe are not being discussed, or maybe I haven't heard the discussions, I'm not aware of them, but I know that it's taken a while as an RCD to bring people up to speed that maybe they want to sequester carbon. And now the discussion is shifting that maybe that measuring carbon in the soil is not the best way to measure soil health. That maybe measuring soil health is a better way to mitigate climate change. If I'm saying that correctly. You see what I mean?
Mhm.
The discussion is changing, the measurement is changing, and we've just barely gotten people aware of carbon. And now, oops, that may not be the best way to do it. Another thing that I found kind of interesting is the difference of, so back to the soil microbiome, the balance of fungus versus bacteria in the soil and how that relates to the vegetation. And is it different in farmed soils versus like no-till or rangeland or forests? And then finally, that we're not talking about forests as part of agriculture, which at a federal level, USDA sees forest land as ag, and NRCS provides cost share programs for farm forests. And I imagine that CAL FIRE probably has a climate strategy, and we're not including CAL FIRE as a state agency, or are we? That's just a topic of discussion that I am interested in. That's it.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Yes, Member Buffington.
Sure. I just had a few comments and thoughts. As you were talking, I was thinking about who the audience was meant to be, and you had listed kind of a variety of targets, and I think that is going to be multi-levels of discussion, different types of discussion. So it'll be interesting to hear and see how those different types of target audiences get incorporated into the final document. I mean, from an agency's perspective, I think it would be fantastic to have a document that we could look towards to see all of the efforts that our sister agencies are doing, how they're implementing the actions that have been called out in the scoping plan. Like for me, when I think about ARB's role and how all of our planning documents play into one another, we have these two kind of overarching strategies: the scoping plan, which really is looking for greenhouse gas emissions, and then our mobile source strategy, which is really looking at air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. And then those really feed into are more specific and implementable plans, like our state implementation plans. And from my perspective, what I see here is an opportunity to take this overarching policy that all state agencies weigh in on related to the scoping plan and really start to show some implementable actions that are being taken in the ag space. So I think it's going to be an incredibly useful document from an agency level perspective. But I can also see how it can be used as a tool when we're going out and talking to farmers, because I mean, I interact with farmers who still argue that climate change isn't real and it doesn't have an impact on their practices. And so having success stories or documentation and things to point to of things that have worked, because I think what we're finding is that there's a lot of word of mouth is really what helps get these kinds of technologies and techniques active and on the ground. So this document would be great, I think, for that purpose too. And then in general, I think thinking about just the general public, right? Like, and I think this gets to some of what you were talking about, Member Diggs, is that, there is just a general anxiety about the future, and food security and is a very big part of that. And having an opportunity for a document to kind of provide insights or thoughts on how to provide that kind of food security would be incredibly valuable. I did notice that in the list of things that you were pointing out about why it's important to develop a climate strategy for California ag, the thing that seemed missing was that key point of it's also a big part of California's economy, right? So if we can make our ag sector resilient and have it persevere through and support and combat climate change, we are not just doing all of the wonderful things that we were talking about related to the environment and public health, but you're also going to be supporting a stronger and more resilient California economy, which I think resonates with a lot of people. I did think it was important to think about how this plays a role and how it's a companion document to the scoping plan, to make sure that those policies continue to stay aligned. So holding true to what has been published and what keeps, what we're updating in the scoping plan is important. And then the other that I wanted to just quickly touch on is you had mentioned identifying research gaps. I think that actually may be more difficult than maybe you're anticipating, because I know at least at our agency, we have many research projects that touch on the agricultural sector. And we, again, are just one of many agencies that you were pointing out in this web of government that's touching the California ag sector. So if there's anything I can do from the perspective of ARB to help on the research gap discussion, I think we at our agency, I think, keep kind of a compendium of the projects that are related to different sectors. So we'll be able to help there. But again, that's a pretty big, many state agencies are researching so many different aspects of how our policies touch on ag. So those are just my initial thoughts. I'm really looking forward to the document and helping.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Member Bright?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So I think I have three things, and they're kind of more on the topic. So thinking about what's really emerging with our focus on groundwater sustainability is going to be the increasing use of fallowing patterns across our ag lands, and understanding kind of how, this document could be a really timely opportunity to lay some groundwork on how to do fallowing in the best way for not only for the local ag economy and ag viability, but also to continue, cover crops or other actions to reduce, all the things. I think there's a real need to talk about cover crops and fallowing, because right now fallowing policies are limiting the opportunities for cover crops, because the way that water is measured through those cover crops is currently the subject of a lot of science. So I think there's a great opportunity to try to use this to kind of put some information out there to create more opportunity for cover crops and fallowing. And then another thing that I think is really important to talk when you're talking about agriculture, especially near urban centers, is the contribution that ag lands provide to reducing urban heat. It doesn't always get acknowledged, but just living in Sacramento, you understand how the winds that come in over agriculture usually bring in a cooler air than the winds that come in over a, concrete cityscape. And then the last one, which I'm sure, you talked to me more about, I think along the way than anyone else, is how do we talk about land availability, land conservation in an ag plan? And I don't have a suggestion at the moment, but it's really important when you see the patterns of development, not only the patterns of development, but then the patterns of ag land coming out of production because of water availability, and how do you do that in a strategic way and not just a piecemeal way?
Thank you. Very insightful. Yes, Member Couch.
Oh, thank you. Well, for the benefit of the panel members and the staff that are going to be working on this effort as it moves forward, I just wanted to make sure they were aware that the water boards are in the early phases of putting together our ag expert panel. They're going to be evaluating our nutrient management programs and making recommendations to the board that would potentially affect your effort on the climate smart agriculture. And so we look forward to working with CDFA on all levels.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Oh, yes. Yes, Member Forbes.
Thanks, and thanks, Deputy Secretary. It's great to hear that this continues and from last time. And just a couple of notes to help, and very happy to continue conversations in collaboration with UCs and Cal States and all the research folks who know both the science and the social science of climate change adaptation, which is important. So on the topics, I think it's a good list of topics, and there was a note on labor, which is important, but then to also think about it as workforce and communities as well. Because, when we go to implement changes, it's oftentimes within local governments that are having to take actions that match up, and then those local governments are looking for sort of funding or resources or technical assistance. And to the extent that that ties back in with CDFA opportunities or federal government opportunities, that would be important. And then also with climate change adaptation strategies, there's really a need to kind of think about urban and rural linkages as well as working lands linkages. And that's maybe a little bit different as a topic than the sort of the sectoral topic of water and so forth, but as a cross sector topic, that how do urban, suburban, rural, and working lands areas all mesh? Because there's a lot of what you get into, I think I mentioned this last time, of system boundaries kinds of questions about where are we going to scope this, and possibly trying to come up with an overarching kind of framework or set of frameworks for the strategy. I think you had the sort of the components of within each section, sort of a description of the challenge, the climate connection challenges, equity components. Those are all great. And then I'm not sure if there's policy outcomes or recommendations that are embedded in these, or if that's a separate outcome, or if that's a bit too ambitious for this strategy as well. But you could provide avenues where you think that either this panel or more broadly other boards and panels related to this question, how are we going to come up with the actionable items that communities could take on as part of this overall kind of effort to implement the strategy. And sometimes you'll look in sort of state or federal documents, and the first thing they'll do is they'll map out the institutional question. And this relates back to the board member's point. And it sort of seems like a bit of an internal exercise, and like, where is this going? But that's actually a very important point to do sometimes, especially with agriculture, is that if you identify all the different kind of components and programs that are involved in this, or set up an effort to do that, then you identify where the policy levers are that are tools for government to use, then can link up with private sector or nonprofit sector opportunities, and an institutional map, kind of where who's doing what. It may be on your radar screen already, but that might be kind of important, and that would also help you with the system boundary question about how far is this going to kind of go. And then the last thing, I was just taking a look back at the 4th climate change assessment plan, and they have the technical reports in there. And I remember noticing this before, that there's a lot with energy and a lot with the water sectors and around the technical report contributions for agriculture. There are several good ones, but I think there could probably be more. And so a question for you is, do you have an opportunity to tie into the 5th climate change assessment? Is that something you're already doing as part of this that would directly inform that?
Yes, you've said so much, but on the 5th assessment question, yes, we're participating. We've been working with the Natural Resources Agency and Office of Planning and Research on selecting topics to fund research projects. And then some of our staff will be following along those projects as they go forward. So we think there are a few really good ones that will inform the strategy.
Great, thanks. And happy to help and support this effort as you go forward.
Thank you. Yes, Member Diggs.
Great. So I'll continue on the topic area. I talk to a lot of farmers that feel that unless there's a business strategy that they can deploy, business plan that they can deploy, that climate resilience and many of the factors that we're concerned about are challenging for them. So how to create a business model for climate resilient farming systems, which is less focused on some of the short-term incentives that we provide with incentive grants, and more focused on long-term investments. And because I think that's going to be the critical step, is how businesses are able to make long-term investments, not be encouraged through incentives. You talked about the circular economy, and I think that the circular design for a circular economy probably needs to come through research institutions at the UC level and our state and community colleges to help create what I call secondary markets for recycled farm equipment, creating innovation hubs, that we are going to need to create those intermediary places in agriculture where a circular economy might truly work. We don't see it as much because the model currently is one and done. You produce something, it goes out the door, and there hasn't been the model for how do you reuse it as much. Sure, a lot of farmers are doing hacks and redoing and reusing, but we need to formalize that. And then in regards to technical service providers, a need to integrate this process. So once people start to realize that there's these systems that need expertise, and that there are other communities out there besides the ones that we are currently partnering with, that could support our effort in terms of technical providers. I'm thinking of organizations like CAF, FarmLink. We've already talked about the RCDs, but young farmers and ranchers that are a part of Farm Bureau. I think that if we try to engage them to provide some of the technical services that are really needed out, because there are so many people that need to have access to technical services, we would further the effort too. And how we begin to actually reach out to those smaller organizations that are not typically recognized, I think is an important component. And I think lastly, I'll say that there has to be a consideration for climate smart tools being leased. We've talked about lending libraries, but I think it starts with a lease program. Many tractor companies have had lease returns that they've done with their equipment over the years. And I think if we start creating leases for the critical tools that are like roller crimpers, drills, that then can be later sold or repaired and maintained for resale, that those programs will start the resale market. That's really critical, because if it's all brand new paint, it's really hard to get it adopted at all levels. That we need a much fuller resale market that's out there. And I guess one more, I'll just say that in terms of research, it's the main thing I think is that there needs to be research associated maybe on the social science level, or in terms of encouraging innovation through industry, private parties, and public entities to do innovation hubs. That there needs to be more innovation hubs that don't just exist at the university level.
Thank you. Yep, thank you. Thank you. Are there others?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Can you expand a little bit on the innovation hubs?
Well, I think I've seen that A&R is starting to do what I can consider to be some innovation hubs. And specifically, they're looking at climate smart tools. You know, we know that there are electric tractors that are being produced, and there are autonomous vehicles and autonomous equipment that's being produced. But the integration of those tools into regenerative farming programs or climate resilient farming programs hasn't been developed. And so I would say the innovation hubs that are needed are the ones that look at current and future technology and how to actually integrate them into some of these climate resilient practices that we are determined, because right now they're just value propositions that people are putting forward and solutions that aren't as integrated.
I'm going to take a shot at a little summary, if in case we'll see what I missed. Please weigh in. So I'm just going to go through as in terms of the presentation itself. I think on the why, it definitely was emphasized no single place, and having a single place would be good. That the idea of even mapping, though, if not used, is not useful, but when used is useful, is what I heard, and might be warranted here of a good mapping so that you could go to that one place and look at what other agencies are doing. And, you know, again, one would think that would tie into, say, the memorandum of understanding and how that flows out into other parts of that. So I'm expanding a little bit, but I'm trying to summarize. And then really, yes, the sister agency piece, which we heard so important, going across, and the economy brought up twice, both the business model itself and the contribution to the economy as being really critical, and make sure that's highlighted. And as sort of the vision of like, and I think it was said a couple of different ways. One is, you know, we do need to provide some lighthouse to the future because folks are concerned. I think Member Diggs eloquently said that. I won't say it as well as you did, but I think there is that urgency and concern. But there's also that urgency and concern to figure out how farmers are going to farm and ranchers are going to ranch. So how do we connect that to, you know, sort of the beacon of light I heard that come across both on the first mile and sort of the last mile, if you will, to the pub consumers and our youth. Strategic food security, that seemed like that might be missing. It's critically important, and Member Buffington raised that, and I think that's really it is important. I'll have a few statements about that I'll make in just a second. And then, you know, that the true resource constraint issues that we're dealing with, that Member Bright brought up, the groundwater sustainability, the fallowing, well, is that even the right word? Fallowing, cover cropping, management of land, right? You raised all the topics. What does that really mean when land's out of one use into a different use, and how do we make that use the best and highest use for all the public good and such? I think that was raised, and its contributions, things like heat and weather, which I think that was really, for those that have enjoyed driving over in the traffic of the Delta coming here and know that's 10 degrees cooler when you get to that part of the freeway and you're going like, wow, this is great. And yeah, land conservation and what meaning that has in that broader landscape, working land setting and not. And then I think we touched on some of the topics, not all, but of course the circular economy, labor, workforce being critical, you know, that component of, you know, being a choice, wanting to work in agriculture, the next gen, versus it being lower on the proverbial list of where you might want to enter the workforce. So making it the next part of careers for and then yes, the notion of the innovation hub and how there's a lot of components that need to be in place for people to actually do this, the boots on the ground part, that unless we think through that and are recognizing that, those would be issues. Any other misses? I'd like to just talk about a few things. I used to, starting in 2016, every 2 years, I used to provide an international update to a couple of my clients. I don't do that anymore. But the 2002 FAO data came out in December 27th. Now, you could ask why I was looking on December 27th at the 2002 data released by FAO, but I was interested because it was first out. And just to note a couple of things. In 2016, nuts were not on the list. Nobody was tracking nuts globally. Was off the list. And I'm going to take a little credit that I said, why is that? And I communicated to some folks that nuts should be on the list. So now in that report, almost all California crops are on that list, except there's two major ones missing, macadamia nuts and pecans. They didn't have someone like me back then, so shame on them. But what I'm saying is that California is now in a unique position because unless we're on the global map, we don't exist. If we grow 100% of the almonds in the US here. We grow similar amounts of pistachios. We're number one in 80 to 90% of those crops. So what really becomes important is the international component of those other places that are grown and the beacon of light that we shed on that. So I just want to say that the world is now in a position to actually pay more attention because they literally were not paying attention before. There was no global data on a bunch of crops grown in California. And that's a significant piece of information that goes to the food security and goes to the importance of the economy and the business model and such that, you know, we were literally not on the world stage and we are now in a big way. And I think it also is a testament that, and many of people have heard, and we hear this as well, is that how are we going to feed the 9, 10, whatever billion people? And there's an assumption in there that the consumption leads to certain kinds of consumption. I won't refer to the other kind of consumption. What I will refer to is the growth in fruits, nuts, and vegetables is also directly tied with income around the world. So the more people's income, the more they want to eat fruits, nuts, and vegetables. So that's important for the health reasons and the business model. You know, what is our fundamental business model? There's a lot, and it's not just that. I mean, it's all the other 397 crops I just didn't mention. So I just wanted to raise that, and I think the yeah, I'll just stop there of just talking through why that strategic importance and why. Oh, I know. The last is being bold and audacious because of the urgency, Leonard, that you articulate. I think we can. And sorry, I should have tied those world stage, us being bold and audacious. Probably put those two dots together. Sorry, miss that. I think that was referenced here all along. All of us want this to be the best and the brightest and the shininess and that beacon of hope. So I do feel like getting this right and for all the reasons that what is so exciting is to hear it across the agencies, right? As California Ag thrives, so does California Energy, so does California Conservation, so does California's air, climate, and oceans and water, et cetera. So I think how we do this is really important. And I appreciate this opportunity and the thought and really thoughtful comments across the board of that. Yeah, my brain wasn't working quite as strong as it could have there. Last, I'd say the research question came up and I think it is a very complicated for all the reasons that everyone explained here. And so I guess the question would come is, do we come back to soil health and come back to our source, like really, where are we strong? And then maybe, there's an area where maybe we're not strong, but this panel's already made a statement in the Regen Ag framework of including human health. And why I'm bringing this up is there is a National Academy of Science panel right now on the relationship between soil health and human health. It's a very interesting panel. There's a clinical professor at UCSF, and there's our own Kate Scow from UC Davis, who's on that, the two Californians. And they have already, and there's some publications and things that will absolutely are fascinating, publications on the incident of COVID to soil types in the area, things that you would just never think would be related. Turn out they are related to soils and soil management. So maybe that is our one thing where we have already stuck a beacon out there of like, let's include human health, but let's do it to something that we're really, really, really a state that's so good at is soil health research. We have some of the world-class folks. We have practitioners that have been doing it for 30 years. So I don't know, that's just a little like, if we're going to get really practical, maybe we get practical on soil health and what that means. Going to member Dolly's comment, is carbon the right one? We should have a discussion at least, right? Rather than, ask the question, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, but maybe it's broke, right? At least we have to ask the question, and might not be broke, but important to ask the question, right? And then, as I said, the last piece might be something pretty aspirational, which is soil health related to human health.
Yeah, that was sort of a visionary summary. Thank you. That was great. And I think, my comment about this, I have a lot of comments, but I do wonder, listen, it seems like there's a pretty strong element in this that's going to be for policy direction, agencies and taking some of the work that's already going on and helping to, as you said, a lighthouse to the future for policy. But so I just wonder, if I look at the topics that you're going to cover in each section, I'm just wondering how you mentioned that you thought it would want to be practical. I'm not sure that that's reflected here. I feel like it could be really valuable for agency people, but I wonder, it's going to have areas for additional research. So maybe it is going to be practical or useful to researchers, but is it going to be written is each topic going to be written as this is a strategic conversation about what we want to see in agriculture moving forward? What is the vision in, I don't know if it's 10 years or 20 years, maybe we're going to say 10 years. And are we going to be visionary in a way that will talk to the public and talk to practitioners? And I'm not sure that I see that reflected in some of the bullet points here. I feel like it's, I'm sure it's definitely in the conversation, but I'm not. I wonder. It would be great to see a little more of that in terms of how the topics, when you're really working on those topics, how they're framed and how they relate. Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And one thing I said the first time I gave this presentation that I failed to say this time is that this is not a expansive, this is not an all-encompassing list of everything that will be in there. There's so many things that just it would be a lot more slides if we were to list it all. And I do hope that it's an opportunity to set a vision for where we're going and how we can all go there together. When you don't have a single place to articulate, where is energy policy going? Where's water policy, land use, like all of these things, I think many of us who are lucky enough to get to work on an interdisciplinary way with all of our agency colleagues and folks outside the state, like we can kind of start to see these tendrils of activities that are happening and see how we're like all kind of moving in a direction, but that's not articulated in anywhere for the public, I don't think. So that I hope that we will do that, and I hope we will have more thorough discussions of these things and everything that you all brought up. And that's what I'm, so I really appreciate all these topics. And I think everything all of you said should be in here. What I think we have an opportunity to do for this panel is to set out the year to, hear presentations from folks who can give us more information on them. We've got a year ahead of us of meetings, and normally that would be 3 or 4 more. And so it's an opportunity to bring in expert speakers, folks from other agencies, if that's what we want to do. You mentioned work happening outside the state, Jeff. So yeah, I feel like the sky's the limit, and that's what I really hope to solicit from the panel today is like, what would you like to talk about in regards to the strategy that can help inform it?
Member Redmond is like, it sounds so that, big vision, big strategy, and then what you're looking for is like, let's get into some of the details, like how this might actually apply in the field to your California farmers and ranchers, like in some specific, like touching the ground, I guess is the question. There's a concern that we may just stay here and never get our feet on the ground, right? Is that am I articulating that right?
One thing that occurred to me is that there's a whole ecosystem of organizations that do work with practitioners on these kinds of issues. And I know that they're all have been invited to participate in these kinds of conversations, but I wonder if one of the focused groups that could be brought together to have input would be with those organizations that spend time, like RCDs and organizations that Member Diggs mentioned. CalCan is another one, of course. Maybe their input, because they work directly, they all have farmer advisory boards and work directly with farmers, maybe their input would be helpful in this regard, because many of them have a strong focus also on policy and help to implement policy.
Thank you. Yeah, I really believe this is good to consolidate and bring agencies together and see where the direction is. But I guess my question is, who's the final audience, and who's going to benefit from putting this together? Is it going to go down to different agencies? Is it going to be down to a grower level, something that can be implemented on the ground? Is it going to be solution driven? And is it going to be a living document that has continual change as it moves forward?
Yeah, so I think on the audience question, it truly is all of us. It's not only a way for us to communicate to ourselves within CDFA, within ourselves as a state, but also to the public and broader stakeholders. And so, yeah, I think these documents often are, and so I'll definitely be looking for expertise and advice from my state agency colleagues. And then what was the second part of your question? Oh yes, living document. yeah, I mean, a lot of these things end up, as with Ag Vision, where you're updating them every few years. And I hope we would do that. I don't think it's going to be a one and done situation for us in agriculture. So I would think we would provide regular updates.
Thank you.
I want to build off of that a little bit too about who it's for. I think some of our grant programs, especially in these big funding years, have kind of happened to us. They've come from outside. They're not, and they're good ideas, but maybe they aren't grounded in what's actionable from a state implementation perspective, or we could have worked with our stakeholders better to craft those programs. And so I think that this plan is an opportunity to work with our stakeholders, work with this panel, and try to articulate a vision together about where state investments would be the most impactful. And I think one of the really key parts of that, to what Member Redmond was saying, is thinking about the near term. I feel like strategic plans that are a morass of near and long-term goals can be hard to follow, and it's hard to understand what your marching orders are. So I think it'll be really important that we identify a set of near-term priorities. This will also bound the research question. Somebody was saying, there's so many research questions. Well, there's probably a few that you could say we should be investing in right now. Like, we need to get over these to get to the long-term vision. And so I'm hoping that this plan can kind of have the near-term things like 3 to 5 years in focus, while also like looking at that longer-term vision. I think that'll be really important for not getting overwhelmed by the sheer enormity of the task. So yeah.
Use this example to make sure I understand and we get this out, some concerns and how that might look. So we got the presentation on the MOA with federal government, state government, RCDs, and the university. And then importantly, in Carolyn's presentation, it was tied directly to the local CBO, the community-based organizations and the NGOs, so that you had sort of fed, state, regional actors, RCDs, university, but then it was also connected. Is that the kind of thing you were just talking about, like something that looks like that, but in other areas? I mean, that was specifically around technical assistance for these grant programs. So but one could imagine that circle be bigger, and then you have other state agencies, right, that would be in that circle, and maybe even other federal agencies, look, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Department of Energy or something. We could, but then make sure that it's tied to the CBOs and the NGOs. And I do separate NGOs and CBOs, right? I mean, there's international NGOs that are as bureaucratic as anybody, right? So just being an NGO doesn't make you good, bad, or indifferent as far as I'm concerned. Especially look at the salaries of some of the NGO people, you'll be surprised. So CBOs to me are really the community-based organizations that are in the communities, working, living there, know what's going on. And so is that kind of that connectivity tissue, or is that, am I not really in the ballpark? Or not sure yet. I'm just trying to figure out how we provide some why I'm asking this is, how do we provide guidance? Like, okay, this looks right, go farther there, or no, that's really not it. That's going to take us to this dead end that is a concern that it won't get used. That's the only reason I'm asking these questions, is like, how do we provide guidance on this, so it gets so what does that mean to make sure that it touches the ground and it serves California farmers and ranchers? What is that end point of this? And I guess that's really what my bigger question. I was grappling for an example, and it might not have been a good one. But yes.
Well, on that, just a couple of ideas, and they may be bad ones, so that's totally fine. Well, it's a good prompt. And so if you start with the agricultural sector GHG emissions pie here, if I'm in leadership of someone who can do something about this, I say, okay, what do I prioritize and how do I do it? And maybe remember, that's to your point. And so I think for this panel, being able to connect up, as you're talking about the connective tissues across organizations. So there's research questions that go in here. And I think one of them is contemporary right now about the nitrous oxide emissions and how it relates back to the GHG funding for some of the programs. And so that's that's like an obvious point of something that can be tackled. And then on these other strategies of there's a certain amount of funding that's available, where do you prioritize this to make the most amount of impact from an emissions standpoint, but then also one that is impactful for communities, that maintains intact communities, and provides opportunities for workforce adaptation and jobs in kind of rural and working areas, and how that connects back to cities too. So, if you take just this, a strategy plan would be to say, how do we adjust these pies to reduce the emissions and also set up California agriculture for success in the future? So some tangible set of questions like that around working with CARB's experts on the methodological accounting of this, and then, okay, what do we do about it, right? We know we can electrify vehicles. We know we can, install solar or wind for renewable energy reductions and so forth. So how does it relate to agricultural practices and implementation?
Thank you. That's great.
I mean, in some ways, I felt like this chart at the end could be the organizing principle for the strategy document in a funny way, like better than, I feel like the list of topics can be, there's like almost a dozen topics. And I just wonder if it was organized very explicitly around where the biggest impacts are going to be, that might, I don't know. I mean, I feel like some of the things that are listed as topics actually are overarching, like they fit into every single topic. Others are issues, like heat and water, I mean, so I'm just, I mean, it's a really good list of topics, but I feel like some, so it might be almost too many as an organizing principle of a report.
I am 100% taking recommendations on organization because this is a lot. So yeah, if you think it should be by, the emissions of a particular gas from a particular source, like we could do that.
It's just an idea.
Yeah.
We're just brainstorming here. But when I saw this chart, when I first saw it, I felt like it was very impactful, and I almost wanted to start rearranging the topics. and excuse me, I'm sorry. And perhaps when we do move forward in the year with speakers, we want them to sort of refer back to some of these concerns about nitrous oxide and methane and CO2 that are in agriculture, or problems in agriculture.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand what some of the recent discussion was leading to. How to use the document. Is that just a concept of how we're going to use the document, or is that something that's going to be built into the document of how we're going to use it? Because that would really change an organizational structure also, if you added how it's going to be used.
Well, I think if you have ideas about how it should be used, not to just throw it back at you, but it's often useful for me to look at other state agency documents to find out what's happening. And that's the way I use it. But you may have other ideas, and this panel, I really value your input and how it would be useful for the people that you work with.
Right. Yeah. Oh, well, I was just going to answer that I would need to think about that. Don't have an answer right now, but I know that we're working, our organization is working on a strategy right now, and built into the strategy is a commitment to using it. And so part of that document is going to be, this is how we're going to use it. We promise it is not going to go on a shelf. It's going to be used in this way and this way and this way. And I think that would be really useful. And as I said, I don't have an answer for how this document should be used because I hadn't thought of it that way until right now. But I think it would be good because too easy to have things end up on a shelf.
Yeah, Member Redmond triggered for me just that I was stumbling over the word topic. And it reminded me that when we were asked to come up with a definition for regenerative ag, we gravitated towards creating a framework. And that the framework was really the organizing principle that really helped us move forward what we wanted to share back with the board. And so in thinking about this, maybe we need to come up with a particular word that really helps us organize it better, like agricultural responsibility, areas of responsibility, something that allows us to clarify what our role is or what our target effort is going to be. And so I don't think we have to solve that now, but some of those words might be helpful.
Building off expert Porth's comment and what you just said, Member Redmond, I have a question for our agency partners here. So if we didn't tackle some of the biggest pieces on here, what would you think? Like if you looked in and you had your scoping plan and Ag has their scoping plan, which you're part of course here, but that seemed pretty compelling. When you made that case and you brought that up, it seemed pretty compelling. Like if we're not addressing those, then maybe we're potentially missing the mark. And it's a question. I'm just saying it was a very valid point. Like if we're not looking at that, then what are we looking at?
I mean, from my perspective, how I understand is that, CARB is the agency that has oversight over climate change, right? Like we are the ones setting policy and we work with all of our sister agencies to set that. So I mean, for me, the value of this document is really getting down to some more of the details on how to do that, because we're not just the oversight agency, right, developing the scoping plan. We also then have lots of groups within ARB that are implementing parts of this. I'm more of a part of one of those implementing groups, right? And so having a document like this as a companion to the overarching policies of the scoping plan, I see that being super helpful in setting things, not just, setting policy around our incentive programs. We have, ag burn, we have a diesel replacement program. We have a lot of community focused projects and programs where they are interested in investing in ag, but maybe don't have a great set of guiding principles, or we might pick something that's maybe really far down the list of what's effective, but if we have a document to look to, we can start thinking a little bit more holistically about how that works. So from my perspective, that's how I see it. And I do respect and understand that, our feet aren't touching the ground analogy that you had pointed out and what you were talking about, Board Member Redmond. But we as an agent, I don't think agencies have necessarily one guiding document to look to for ag. And so for me, that was one of my initial questions too, was who the audience was, because for me as a state agency, I could see a lot of value in having a document like that to look for. But I can also see a myriad of other ways where this document can be supportive and helpful beyond just at an agency to agency level. I mean, Tani, you also mentioned the legislature is coming up with priorities and how we make investments. And sometimes those seem disconnected from the implementing agencies of that funding. And so having a document like this could also be very helpful and useful during legislative conversations when our stakeholders are going in to advocate to support the work that we want to do, right? So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but I mean, those are some of the values that I see. And I agree, like I'm not sure how to make that connection, making the connection all the way up from the ground to agencies and legislature means the document is much bigger and much more complex than something that is targeted to a smaller subset of that large audience.
Well, thank you. Yes, Member Bright.
Those are really good points. So I'm thinking so this administration has been really good at putting out strategies that are actually driving the policy and the funding. And the ones that I've been working on do reach down to the practitioner level in different ways. I'm thinking about the wildfire and forest resilience strategy. That's the basis for all of the work being done by the governor's task force on wildfire. And what's really nice about that is that, like agriculture, wildfire is something that crosses all sectors. So it just overlaps with everyone's policy areas, and it's a fine mess if you don't start to organize things. That strategy helped put some order to kind of the buckets of work being done. And it kept it at a pretty high level, but what's been happening is that within those buckets, they've been digging into implementation strategies that really get into the complexity of each area. So like prescribed fire, for instance, is a strategy that's called out in the bigger strategy for, ongoing maintenance of lands. But it doesn't go into all of the things that all of the practitioners need to do across all these landscapes. But the prescribed fire implementation strategy that the volunteer committee kind of worked on is working through some of those, and also working with the regulatory agencies to try to resolve conflicts so that we can do more of the things that we're saying we need to do. So it's been like a helpful exercise both to elevate conflicts, elevate kind of the details of the strategies, and then bring people together to try to resolve those. Not always totally successful, but often it's been helpful. The other thing that's happening with our state strategies is, I would say nearly all of them intersect with agriculture in one way or the other. And it's nice to have a counterbalance. So when you have a solar strategy for, the big targets and the big land acreages, it would be nice to have that will impact ag lands. It would be nice to have an ag strategy that kind of counterbalances that energy focused report. Or if you have whatever the things are, just having that counterbalance for us in the state agency world, it helps us kind of set our policy priorities. And then I just can't kind of overstate enough how important it is for our own internal processes of bringing resources to our priorities and bringing policy, having something to drive that in the form of a plan that has buy-in from our partners is really, really, really valuable.
Member Hansen has a comment online. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. If you're speaking, we cannot hear you. We might have to workshop this tech issue for a second. If anybody else has a comment while we try to make it happen.
Questions or comments as we're waiting? I might say something else dumb, so I'm taking a risk here. But going on more that bigger, and I no way am thinking on the implementation. But I will say, and I know this has been our great secretary's vision for a long time, is making California the preferred choice for international buyers on the business model side. And I will say I spent a lot of time with consultants who are helping large multinational source, and their biggest issues were you're not Europe with the regulatory, and you have water issues, and we're looking to buy product X somewhere else. And so that was a real issue that, and so I think now when you start to think about, and there was discussion, a lot of discussion, voluntary programs turn into regulations, right? So a lot of people were afraid of assessments or checklists or sustainability, blah, 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 because they turn into, well, we already have all the regulations. So let's just put that aside and say, how do we make lemonade? So how do we compare ourselves to the European Union on their regulatory framework, which we compare quite high, by the way. We are as good as almost any and particularly with implementation. So we could sort of put that aside and actually emphasize that, right? The biggest issue that everyone called out was groundwater, which, because we didn't have any laws, and now we do, and they're getting implemented. So the biggest issue that was the most concerning to international sourcing was the future of California was water. Now it's other things now, including fire. I mean, there's other things too, but that's one of them. It's a big one. So, and then nobody in the other states report their nutrient management plans, their water use, what they plan and what they actually do, which Scott knows, member Couch knows, is incredibly remarkable, right? I mean, nobody in the world does that. Literally nobody in the world does that. And yet, so wouldn't we want to say we're this amazing place to source products? Because, I mean, you may not like it, you may not like we could all, doesn't matter, right? It's here, it is, it exists. So is this in fact creating really strong demand always, because California agriculture is on the cutting edge of climate smart policies. And if you really do concerned about where you source, you should always look at California first. Because if they're doing it, if they're not doing it, then there's a question of why. And that's maybe a policy or political question. But the second one is, what are they actually doing? And when you dive deeper to that, among a lot of consternation from landowners but the reality is there's nothing as robust in terms of resiliency in the marketplace. So in the US. Now, I'm sure I'm going to get some phone calls and texts from my colleagues in other states, but I will say, I think this is an important component around the business model, because a lot of people, when they talk about sort of this, the concept of shared value or creating shared value or all these business models around social and environmentally, what they often lack is a real concrete business model. And the business model here is California is a preferred source of products, both for members inside the state and people outside and internationally. And that makes a very compelling business case, especially if not everybody consumes all our products in California. So we have to have markets in other states and internationally. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that there's ways of thinking about this that might be controversial, maybe stupid. I'll take both those. I'll wear those on my vest today. But I think it's worth brainstorming and opening it up and really having this discussion as we go forward. So yeah.
Member Hansen should be able to unmute and speak now.
She's saved by the bell.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I just, wanted to flag, I think it's been very interesting to listen to the various sort of elements of the discussion here today. And I would just share a couple of reflections, having worked to coordinate the state's climate adaptation strategy and sort of reimagine that strategy. We also coordinated the state's extreme heat action plan and created for the first time a natural and working lands climate smart strategy, which I think I flagged to you. So I've had a lot of experience in strategy development, and I want to echo something that Kaylee E said, which is just that in all of those efforts, what we see as a result is that those strategies guide policy and investment. So I think it's a very important tool to support what we hear is needed to support shifts in state investments and policy that will better deliver what's needed on the ground. So it's a really good opportunity, I think, to identify what is needed, where are we doing well and we need to do more, where do we have a gap, where are we actually hurting ourselves and need to undo something. And I think the other sort of point I want to underscore is just, we have two overarching climate strategies in California. We have the scoping plan, we have the state adaptation strategy. They both reflect and reinforce some of these like sector specific strategies or, climate impact specific strategies. And so for agriculture, I think it's kind of frustrating because, they have to, without their own strategy, which as you all have noted, like there's an economic development, there's a resilience element, there's the nature-based solutions element, there's energy, there's land use. There's just lots of pieces. Without its own space to kind of outline what's the vision here, what's the approach, what's the strategy. I think, you end up having to sort of squeeze yourself into, the overarching vision or intent of a lot of other strategy documents that don't necessarily reflect the full potential for the ag sector. So those are just some of my reflections, having worked on a lot of state strategies. And I guess I'll kind of close by saying, I think, the goal of these state strategies isn't to reflect what's happening everywhere on the ground. It's just not possible, but it's to reflect, an understanding that we have a responsibility to be responsive to the biggest issues that are taking place on the ground, and that these strategies should really be driving toward, organizing themselves around what are those biggest issues and how can what is the state's role and responsibility in, moving things in a positive direction for agriculture. So I'll stop there, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Member Hansen. We're going to open this for public comment. Yes. And are there other panel members, experts want to weigh in on this? Okay, we'll go ahead and open it up if there's any public comment. And then just to be clear, after this, we might have a motion to move forward on this.
I think the request today was, what do you want to hear about at the panel?
Okay.
And what do you want to focus on for the year?
So we'll come back after public comment and answer those two questions.
Great.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and read two comments at once that I think are related. One is from Kimber Moreland, and they say, there are many strategies for soil carbon sequestration. In this report, will the nuances and potential drawbacks / harm be included in the document? And a second anonymous attendee said, I agree with the point about how to measure carbon sequestration. How is the group approaching this to ensure rigor?
I'm not sure we're going to answer. Are there other, we could take those all in and then we can decide how we're going to do that. Yep.
Yeah, I'm not sure that is totally answerable by the panel, but it's good feedback for the Deputy Secretary. There's one last comment on topics, which might be helpful for the action item. This is from Tanya Goncalves. A few thoughts on the proposed topics. One, soil carbon sequestration suggests looking at all soil greenhouse gas exchanges, including nitrous oxide. Extreme heat. Again, I think this is too narrow as there are many weather-related risks: extreme weather, chill hours, frost, fog patterns, pollinator weather, etc. The third is labor, broader effects on the people and communities involved. The fourth is economic market. How will we ensure ag will survive these risks economically? Insurance, ag-based communities. And then the last one is policy consequences. As policies come into effect, what are the burdens faced by farmers and how can we address these? That's it.
Does anyone want to respond to any of those questions or comments? We can also just note those.
We just had another one come in from Claire Broom, who'd like to make an oral public comment, I believe. Claire, we're unmuting you or allowing you to speak now if you want to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate being able to make an oral comment. I'm Claire Broom, representing 350 Bay Area in environmental advocacy, and I'm also an adjunct faculty of public health. I work primarily in the energy area and have commented on the carb scoping plan. So the dilemma that the panel is facing is understandable and difficult, but also really important to resolve. Our organization is trying to address the climate crisis. To do that, we need to draw down the carbon that is already in the atmosphere. The country, state, federal, are spending billions of dollars for engineered carbon removal, carbon capture and sequestration, which in pilot after pilot has been shown that it does not work. So to me, the critical importance of the natural and working lands strategies, AB 1757, what you're engaged in, is really central. And I don't think you need to have all the answers. As somebody who's done applied research, I would say you're at, and I've attended Eco Farm for a couple of years, although I'm not a farmer. I think you don't have all the answers, but you have a huge opportunity to actually explore and document what it is that can be done in croplands, rangelands, also, as Michelle noted, in forestry, to sequester very substantial amounts of carbon. My recommendation and suggestion is that you particularly pay attention to the National Academy of Sciences recommendation for independent verification and validation of what's being done. I would suggest that as you give research funds, as you give program funds, you have dedicated separate funding streams for an appropriate range of measurements. You all can talk about whether it's soil biodiversity or soil carbon or all the other important parameters, but it shouldn't be subtracted from the funding that goes to farmers and ranchers. It should be a separate stream which provides the resources to get samples and also supports reference laboratories so that the data are interpretable. I think the value of really documenting the impact of what you're doing. And, I sat there and, the no-till arguments and the how many cover crops and, there's a lot of questions out there. And I'm really impressed by how people are trying to answer those. But I just think as you move along, putting out these program dollars, being sure that you're investing in independent, standardized measurement is important. One final comment. A lot of this ultimately gets rolled up into models, and CARB has the champion modeling responsibilities. And models are not reality. We do the best we can with what we know, but I would say we need to look at it as iterative. And I'll pick on forestry, where there's just as many controversies as you have in croplands. The models that currently are used to determine how much carbon is sequestered in forest land have been seriously contested with data-backed studies showing much different calculations. I'll close now, but I'm just saying, if we look at this as an iterative, cross-disciplinary effort that is of supreme importance to both California agriculture, but also to the climate and the world. And thank you so much for all of your important discussion and consideration today.
Thank you for your comment.
There are no further comments on this topic.
Oh. Okay. So before we open it up to general public comment, our task at hand, and I'm just looking at a couple of the sheets. One is the guidance on IDing research gaps. We will be reviewing the document as that comes out. I think the big question is relevant topics for the meeting to inform the document, which ties to the research gap and what aspects of, switching to another sheet, what aspects of climate agriculture have not had robust public discussion that could happen here, right? That's one of our venues, is if there are issues that we need to get some expertise or hear from, maybe the soil carbon, soil health might be one. I'm just throwing that out as come up. And then I think, well, tied to that is what areas of science are rapidly advancing and warrant more discussion. So really, Deputy Secretary, looking for some guidance on like who might be at our next meetings and what topics are they going to be talking about and how they're going to fill that in. I think there's some outstanding questions, which is our audience, and we've heard, that's going to be a challenge as Member Buffington. The greater the target audience, the bigger the document becomes to be relevant to those. Otherwise, it gets too short and it's meaningless to everybody. So that's a tension. And then I think, Member Dolly's comment of, do we bake in implementation execution? Like, do we make sure this document is a living document that has where the execution is actually part of the goal? I think that was those are some of the topics on sort of the procedural side. I'm missing anything missing in there that? Okay. So some suggestions on what those might be. Yes, Member Redmond.
Just from the point of view of being a humble learner here, I would like to, I feel like a lot of the comments and the conversation has been around carbon, but I would like to learn more about soil nitrous oxide emissions.
We did do a little session about like not having to have too much time if everyone agrees. So is that something that everyone's good with? They don't really care or not? Is there anybody that doesn't want that to be, has a strong opinion? Okay, so it sounds like that's an important opinion for everyone. Everyone shares opinion.
Sure. I mean, you brought up soil carbon, soil health, soil diversity. I think there's a lot to be learned that we really, I feel there's a gap there. And maybe we can make our soils maybe better able to sequester carbon by changing the diversity in our soil, possibly, or what constitutes a healthy soil.
Yeah, I would second that. I would like to hear from the biodiversity folks. That I don't remember how long it was ago, but it was a while back that we had them come in and do a presentation, and they I would think that they've done a lot more since that time. So they might be able to provide some good input.
Great. So we have that second. Member Redmond?
I'm sorry, can I just go back to this nitrous oxide? I think, wrapping the policy context into that conversation would be helpful. I mean, the Irrigated Lands Program is a huge program, has a huge database of information about farm operations, farm practices around nitrogen. I'd love to hear more about has that been an expensive program? Has it been an effective program? I think practitioners have a lot of questions. So I feel like that would be part of that conversation is what kind of strategies moving forward do agencies think they're going to use?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm wondering if it would also be appropriate to include our fertilizer research and education program, maybe as part of a panel or something.
Well, I would like to add that the Irrigated Lands Program is will be the primary focus of this ag expert panel. That I don't know when they would have results, but they're likely not to be panel members until sometime in the fall. So probably it'll be next year, but they will be evaluating the Irrigated Lands Program, Confined Animals Program, all the ones that have nutrient management plans or issues.
So that might be we'll have probably 4 meetings, so maybe that'll fit in the year. Could be. Yes, Member Porce.
Yeah, possibility for a portion of a program on or focused on methane emissions. You know, it's a much more potent greenhouse gas, but then it also sounds like there's some current and potentially emerging research and implementation programs that provides an interesting avenue to say, if we could project the, you know, potential impacts of what those programs would be, it'll give you you could benchmark that against what the gaps are for like total impact overall. And that would give you in that area one kind of one way to figure out what is feasibly possible with current funding and then what funding gaps are.
Yes, Member Dolly.
Yeah, I thought the comment on weather was a good comment, and instead of extreme heat, just extreme weather. There are a lot of weather effects.
So it seemed there, I'm not sure if this is one or two topics, but I mean, basically we've had members talk about the pie chart and various aspects of it. We just, whether it's methane or nitrous oxide or CO2. And I know combustion's even part of it through the engine replacement, but I'm just wondering if that soil health sort of nitrous, I mean, that may be maybe two meetings, but it may be one meeting. Yes, Deputy Secretary.
It kind of sounded like two meetings to me, because I think there's that soil like health and biodiversity conversation, and then on the emissions side, maybe what we're doing to address it, like we talked about our new sweep quantification methodology earlier.
Okay. Any on water, I'm just going through some of the big topics. Water, any sense that we need to have something in there around water? And I think it probably is most tied on the side around land repurposing and what do we do? I mean, there's two issues. One, obviously access to it, but that's a separate. There's policies going to be in place around conservation, and is that an area of sufficient that we should talk about that?
I mean, my thinking is that you know, the theme of how do we set a vision for agriculture to thrive through these different impacts, and one of those is availability of water, and like how do we think about it's kind of more becomes almost both a land use and a technical question, but how do you set a vision for agriculture to get to thrive through the changing footprint of ag land in these different parts of the state because of water availability, not so much a study on groundwater.
No,
right?
no,
Like
right. So
it's
it's more, and this may be happening somewhere. Oh, yes, member.
Yep. No, I agree with you. There's so many other effects of, you know, let's just say repurposing or idling ground that, you know, you talk about, you know, cooling your communities. Well, if you don't have the crops being grown, you're changing the dynamics throughout the whole region. Not only possibly particulates in the atmosphere, you could be you're just changing a lot of different dynamics when you start taking ground out of production.
A question I mean, this is a heavy topic, controversial. So, but it's also, we can focus on the very technical science piece of this, you know, like what are the consequences to particulate matters and water and biodiversity? I mean, there's just nuts and bolts questions. So is there another forum, or if there's not, does that sound like in the meeting mix? I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know enough to know if this isn't this is the panel to have that discussion. It might very well be, because we have a lot of expertise here, and I think it would be valuable because I haven't heard it anywhere else. But I don't want to speak for, you know, this. No, this will be controversial. Just everybody should know that going in.
We never do anything controversial, huh?
No, never.
I haven't kind of heard that big picture land use conversation really happen. It happens in like fits and starts elsewhere. So I'd be interested in it. And going back to what Member Porce said about interconnectivity of urban and rural areas and the services they provide and how they're related.
And workforce development as well.
Workforce.
I mean, this has the
Ties into
agrovoltaic.
a lot
I mean,
of
this has all
different
kinds of things going. I mean, we would hear from people that are working on all kinds of stuff, right? And the position, and I think it would be really interesting, but so.
Yeah, I don't know who would be the right person to present, but I would be very interested in the nexus between the fallowing of ag lands and how that relates to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Whether it's DWR, whether it's Water Board, I'm not sure whether it's one of the groundwater sustainability agencies that's kind of out in the lead on this, that may be having to deal with those issues.
Mm-hmm. Anybody doesn't want to do that? Thumbs down.
I think we need, this starts to open up into an everything conversation. I think there are I think we need to be careful. I think talking about how local agricultural economies can continue to produce both food and fiber and economic activity through these challenges, to me, is the framing that makes sense for maybe this report. This group maybe, but definitely in the report, but talking about, and some of that will go down to the practices of how do you implement a thoughtful fallowing, plan that both incorporates cover crops and water capture or whatever the things are. But that, I don't know if we want to we need to be careful not to expand too far into this group hearing every solar presentation, water presentation, because I think we just would be completely overrun by it.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I'd actually say we'd look to some guidance to prevent that from happening through folks like yourself, right? I mean, I think it won't work any other way. But I do think there's some science related questions here that are really important. And I'll pick a simple measure of soil carbon. I mean, you could fallow land and not do anything and have a soil carbon measurement. And you could come back a year later and have a soil carbon measurement. It might not have changed at all. But is that the same thing as if you cover crop that ground and burned all that carbon when it got tilled and everything else? Or do we weigh those the same? Because a simple carbon measurement won't get you there. So I think this ties into a core question. Same on water, on the water use and the cover. So there are some really fundamental science, soil health, biodiversity related questions that come around that. And if that was our scoping, that seems like that would keep it. Does that?
I think that exactly.
Okay. If I'm wrong, you all have to help me here. So that it is around this question of land, multi-benefit land use, repurposing. I mean, that whole area of what do you do when you don't have enough water to do the commercial agriculture as it was in the past, and what do you do going forward? And really, what are those scientific questions around soil, really the fundamental issues of soil, which gets to erosion, whether that's wind, right? Because then or water erosion or soil carbon or habitat and species. I mean, this does cut across all those areas in terms of those really nature-based solutions, ecosystem services kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like what we're doing instead of helping you is we're just adding to your list. So I'm wondering if there's a way of grouping these topics like in chapters. And so some of the new topics that have come up, they really are subtopics of things that are already here. And could there be an economics chapter that has the labor, the international collaboration, building the circular economy? Right. I mean, there's got to be a way to simplify this instead of making it more complicated.
Yeah, and luckily for me, I have a really smart team to work with, and we can work on the internal organization of the document. But I think I'm hearing some kind of overarching themes that could potentially be the meetings for the rest of the year, and I can reiterate back what I've just heard, if that would be helpful. But I can also wait in case there were additions, and then maybe Michelle has an addition.
I don't have an addition. It's something that will tie into what you're going to talk about next is what is your timeline? Like, when do you want to have the reports out? Because we just identified like 6 meetings that we might want to have, and that might not fit with the timeline of when you want to publish a document.
Yeah, I've been warned against giving myself a hard deadline, but 2025. Yeah, and I'm getting a thumbs up from you. I think in the past, you all have had, 4 meetings a year, 5 meetings a year. And so you could also decide to have a 5th one this year, too. And I feel personally flexible on what you decide to do there, whether you want this to stretch into 2025 or try to knock all these things out this year. Totally agnostic on that point. Yeah, so what I've heard you all mention so far as meeting topics are soil health, soil carbon, below ground biodiversity, and then separately soil nitrous oxide emissions, the policy context around those. So hearing about the irrigated regulatory lands program. We might want to hear about our SWEEP program too, and our fertilizer research and education program, just as suggestions. And then separately on methane and the activities we have underway there, and then potential interventions. I'm thinking of enteric methane there. We haven't talked about that in this context. And then separately, extreme weather impacts on agriculture across the board. We listed extreme heat in the PowerPoint, but of course it could be flooding. We had, some of both last year, drought and flood and heat, all of it. And then separately, this overarching discussion on how agriculture can continue to produce through those challenges. And it sounds like there's a land use element there, a workforce element there, what we do with fallowed land. And so when I add it up, I see those as, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 different topics, 5 different meetings. Yeah. So maybe stretching into 2025 here, which is fine. We need things to look forward to. So
it seemed that there was some consensus for the first meeting really being around, well, I wasn't sure. Is it more the nitrous oxide or is it more the soil biodiversity? One of those two we seemed, and I'll just put it out there because we could be iterative as we have a meeting and refine it, and you get further along, you have more to present and we can go forward. But if we're really lockstep on meeting 1, 2, I think that gets you going. Anybody have strong feelings about one way or the other pick?
Well, from the standpoint of already kind of knowing who the soil health folks are, because we've been working with them for the past year through the below ground biodiversity effort, that might be a nice, easy place to start, easy from the logistical standpoint. And then for the ones afterwards, it would take some work on our side to, find the right people. And we'd certainly welcome suggestions from you all on who those right people are too. But yeah, I think that's a good starting place with soil health, and then not nitrous oxide after that.
Get you going.
Yeah.
Yeah, sufficient. And we can't ask, they actually did, we can't ask them to emphasize some of the research gaps, and we can even ask them about research gaps around some of these areas like nitrous oxide. We could cheat a little bit and get that in meeting 1. So, ask them to address some of those topics. I think they would be more than happy to do that. Okay. Any other that you want from us, seek from?
I think that helps. That really helps. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the discussion and the suggestions, and you've all given me a lot to think about. So I really appreciate your input and expertise.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I think we're right at wrapping up. We're going to do general public comment.
At this point, if anybody has any general public comment, I don't see anything in the Q&A and I don't see any hands raised. I'll give you a few moments to change that. Seeing none.
Okay. And we are set for Josh has done a great job of corralling us cats. Thank you very much, Josh. Our next meeting. So I think at this point, I'll entertain any motions to adjourn unless there's any other. So move by member Cameron,
Second.
second by member Buffington. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Though opposed, hearing none. Okay, unanimously passed. Thanks, everyone. Great meeting.